Tonight, we are quietly entering one of the most misunderstood areas of medieval existence. This is a space shrouded in myth, half-truths, and centuries of conjecture. We're not delving into the dramatic torture chambers depicted in films, nor the chaotic underground mazes found in video games, but rather the actual historical prisons that lay beneath castles, courts, and city ramparts. These locales were considerably simpler, much quieter, and in many respects, far more illuminating about the workings of medieval society. So, before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like this video if you appreciate these tranquil late-night historical explorations. Afterward, kindly share in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. It is always compelling to observe our small, nightly gathering of viewers from across the globe. Now dim the lights, arrange your pillow, and allow the world to soften around you. Tonight, we descend slowly, not into horror, but into history, not into dread, but into comprehension. This is an account of what medieval dungeons were truly like. The initial point we must grasp is that medieval prisons were never conceived as sites of perpetual torment. Their function was predominantly administrative. Medieval legal processes unfolded slowly. Trials were frequently postponed due to travel, adverse weather, or bureaucratic delays. Disputes between feudal lords necessitated time for negotiation. The verification of debts required a period. Agreements regarding ransoms mandated the conveyance of correspondence across kingdoms. Consequently, individuals required secure confinement until resolutions could be reached. Thus, the dungeon served as a waiting area for the medieval populace, a place where time elapsed differently, where days passed in silence, and where an individual's future hung precariously in the unseen halls of authority. The majority of those who found themselves in these confined spaces were not hardened criminals. Many were simply individuals embroiled in disputes, travelers with outstanding debts, political figures who had become inconvenient, or minor offenders awaiting the subsequent phase of a legal procedure that could extend for weeks or months. The dungeon functioned less as a form of punishment and more as a holding facility hewn from stone. However, this role as a holding area did not render it a comfortable environment. The very design, situated deep underground, removed from sunlight and warmth, fostered a milieu that profoundly influenced every moment a prisoner experienced within. As your eyes adjust to the quietude of this subterranean realm, another element begins to materialize. Something unrelated to stone or construction, but intrinsically connected to the individuals who oversaw these areas. The guards who patrolled the corridors, the officials who held the keys, the administrators who managed records and fees. Their presence shaped life in these depths as significantly as the very walls themselves. Guards were not the faceless specters of legend, nor were they the melodramatic villains imagined in subsequent literature. They were common medieval laborers, frequently former soldiers, occasionally aging retainers of a noble household, no longer capable of participating in military campaigns. Many had weathered more winters than wars, and their armor, if worn, was a practical assorted collection, rather than an imposing uniform. Their occupation demanded resilience more than ruthlessness. They were obliged to traverse the identical cold corridors daily, monitor cells that rarely changed, and manage an environment where monotony was the sole constant. Some guards approached their responsibilities with an air of detachment, performing their duties with the same unvarying pace as a craftsman working a lathe. Others displayed a degree of engagement with the individuals incarcerated here, occasionally extending small, cost-free acts of benevolence, such as sharing gossip from the world above or engaging in brief conversations. A few took pride in maintaining order without resorting to cruelty, perceiving themselves as custodians of a necessary but unpleasant societal function. Their attitudes varied as widely as the temperaments found within any medieval town. Their challenges were substantial. A guard had to maintain vigilance in a place intentionally designed to dull the senses. The uniformity of the stone, the stillness of the air, the predictable cadence of daily patrols, All could lull even a disciplined mind into a state of fatigue. Yet guards bore the responsibility not only for ensuring prisoners remained confined, but also for maintaining the operational integrity of the facility. They inspected ventilation shafts to prevent blockages. They monitored water levels during seasonal inundations. They coordinated repairs when wooden beams weakened or when dampness eroded the mortar between stones. Some guards had to reconcile professional obligations with the emotional toll of interacting with long-term inmates. Human beings, irrespective of how meticulously separated by law and masonry, inevitably formed mutual perceptions. A guard who observed the same prisoner daily for years might develop a rapport that proved difficult to disregard. They might notice alterations in demeanor, shifts in mood, or indications of illness long before any official record reflected them. The relationship was seldom straightforward. It existed in a liminal space between authority and resigned familiarity, shaped less by empathy and more by the quiet reality of shared routine. A guard might be the sole individual with whom a prisoner communicated for weeks. That tenuous connection, however minimal, influenced the emotional landscape of subterranean existence. Above the guards were the officials responsible for administrative minutiae. They meticulously tracked entries and exits, recorded fees, documented sentences when such records were kept, and liaised with courts or noble estates. Their modest offices, often situated above ground near the primary entrance, were laden with parchment scrolls, wooden ledgers, and stacks of correspondence that passed through their hands, serving as the bureaucratic lifeline of the medieval judicial system. To enter one of these offices, had it been our privilege, would have been akin to stepping into the nexus of the entire institution. There were notations detailing the dates of arrests, lists summarizing minor infractions, letters from families imploring clemency or clarification, and occasional directives from higher authorities altering a prisoner's status without explanation. These documents, though seemingly unremarkable at first glance, were the very threads that connected the silent depths below to the dynamic, unpredictable world above. The officials themselves were seldom dramatic figures. They were scribes trained in literacy, often possessing a rudimentary education acquired at a monastic or cathedral school. They labored for extended periods by candlelight, updating records that were vital, yet rarely lauded. Their decisions could subtly influence a prisoner's destiny. A misplaced document might postpone a release. A correctly filed entry might secure improved provisions for an individual whose family had remitted payment. And while avenues for the abuse of authority existed, there was also scope for minor acts of fairness, particularly from clerks who valued precise record-keeping as an integral part of their professional integrity. Yet beyond the guards and officials, other individuals indirectly shaped this subterranean environment. These included tradespeople who delivered provisions, carriers who transported water or torches, clergy who descended periodically to offer spiritual counsel, and visitors permitted brief, closely supervised encounters with loved ones. Each person who traversed these passages contributed, even inadvertently, to the ambience of the locale. To fully comprehend a medieval dungeon, one must envision not only its physical structure, but also the continuous flow of individuals whose lives became entwined with it. While not all left a discernible mark on the historical record, their footsteps, voices, and decisions filled the atmosphere of these spaces as palpably as the scent of damp stone. Each new set of hands and each fresh perspective added another dimension to an already intricate setting. A dungeon was never merely a cell or a corridor. It represented a convergence of bureaucracy, labor, apprehension, fortitude, and human fallibility. A subtle nexus where medieval society inadvertently revealed aspects of itself that were frequently obscured. Even within a society characterized by strict hierarchies, where monarchs governed kingdoms and peasants cultivated the land, the dungeon occupied a peculiar intersection. It mirrored both the might of authority and the vulnerability of individuals ensnared by its mechanisms. It served as a reminder that medieval life, for all its pomp and pageantry, possessed its shadows, and those shadows were populated not only by prisoners, but also by the very individuals tasked with administering the system that confined them. And as we venture further, the stone walls begin to unveil yet another aspect, something more subdued, yet equally significant. The cadence of daily existence that persisted even within these confined depths. Routines emerged here as well. Time progressed. Individuals adapted. Life, in its quiet, persistent manner, continued. Even in a setting defined by confinement, a distinct daily rhythm took shape. Initially subtle, almost imperceptible, it gradually molded every hour beneath the stone. Medieval dungeons did not operate with the rigid timetables of contemporary institutions. There were no clocks adorning the walls, nor were there bells signaling each passing hour. Nevertheless, patterns materialized, influenced by the guards' habits, the facility's requirements, and the slow procession of the seasons above. The earliest moments of the day often announced themselves not with light, but with sound. Somewhere far overhead, a gate might creak open, allowing a surge of distant clamor to filter down. Vendors calling to their first customers, a cart rumbling over cobblestones, or footsteps echoing in a courtyard. These faint auditory cues seeped through ventilation shafts like delicate filaments connecting the subterranean world to the castle's nascent morning activities. For the prisoners, this transition was subtle. The air might shift slightly as a cooler morning breeze found its way through cracks in the stone. The low murmur of guards commencing their rounds would drift down the corridor, and for some, this provided the closest sensation to dawn they were likely to experience. The meals, though meager and simple, served as more distinct markers of time's passage than the cycles of natural light. A guard might arrive with coarse bread, still firm from yesterday's baking, or with a ladle of warm broth accompanied by the faint aroma of herbs. It wasn't the sustenance itself that held such significance, but rather the awareness that another period of waiting had concluded, marking another milestone in a day largely devoid of distinct features. The activity within the dungeon gradually intensified as the castle above stirred to life. Footfalls became more common in the corridor overhead. A distant exchange between sentries might carry through the heavy portal of a cell. Occasionally, the resonance of a gate being unlatched could be detected, followed by voices too indistinct to fully comprehend. These minor acoustic events, frequently overlooked by those merely passing by, emerged as the principal indicators of the external world's transformation. Still, extended periods of quietude ensued, moments when sound seemed non-existent. During these intervals, the dungeon's stillness bordered on absolute, a silence that enveloped not only the incarcerated individuals, but also permeated their internal states. It was within these tranquil stretches that time relinquished its familiar form. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, a solitary water droplet seeping from the ceiling, falling at unpredictable intervals, could become a form of company, an anchor in a setting where little appeared to alter. Thermal fluctuations also played a role in marking the passage of the day. The dungeon maintained a consistent coolness, yet the atmosphere might become slightly warmer as the castle overhead absorbed solar heat, or marginally colder with the onset of night. These subtle variations were perceptible only to those who had adapted to this environment, with their senses heightened. An individual who had spent months or years underground could discern the transition from afternoon merely by a slight reduction in air circulation through a shaft. The psychological burden of this milieu was considerable. Humans are not designed to exist without variability, without sunlight, without the vivid stimuli that typically define each day. Over time, the mind adapted in subtle ways. Memories blurred, not due to trauma, but from sheer monotony. Past days merged into one another until the sole discernible reference points were the infrequent occurrences: a visitor, a hearing, a shift change among the guards. Nevertheless, individuals devised methods to preserve their sense of self. An inmate might engage in prayer, not solely out of devotion, but to impose structure upon the formless hours. Someone else might hum a tune, repeating the same melody learned in childhood, a melody that aided them in measuring time through means unavailable to any clock. Others would trace patterns on the floor or count their breaths as a means of steadying their thoughts. Even the guards experienced their own temporal rhythms. Following lengthy shifts, they learned to anticipate the cool air currents from specific passageways, the stiffness of hinges requiring attention, the moments when their own footsteps seemed too obtrusive against the stone. Their routines became so interwoven with the physical surroundings that these connections shaped their perception of the dungeon far more profoundly than their official duties. As the day advanced, the castle above grew increasingly active. Visitors arrived, couriers traversed the halls, artisans delivered supplies or performed repairs. These activities reached the dungeon only as faint echoes, yet they served as persistent reminders that life elsewhere proceeded with all its vibrancy and movement. For prisoners who had endured years of confinement underground, the sound of laughter drifting down a corridor could evoke a pattern they had almost forgotten, the cadence of ordinary existence. Evening ushered in a gradual abatement of activity. The guards' steps changed as shift changes occurred. The castle's busyness softened, giving way to the occasional report of a door being secured for the night. The dungeon mirrored this transition with a deeper quietude, and the air seemed to grow heavier as the absence of motion settled around the stonework. Night represented the most indefinite period of all. Devoid of light, sound, or even the minor fluctuations in daytime airflow, the dungeon descended into a silence that felt eternal. Hours slipped by unnoticed. For certain prisoners, this was the most arduous stretch, when internal thoughts gained prominence over the external world, and memory occupied the void left by sensory quietude. Yet even in darkness, the dungeon possessed a form of delicate order. It persisted, not through disarray, but through these quiet, recurring patterns. Through the constant patter of water, the subtle hum of distant life above, the soft tread of a guard ensuring all remained secure. Day after day, year after year, this rhythm molded the lives of all who passed through these confines. Castle garrisons altered, political landscapes shifted. Monarchs ascended and fell, yet the dungeon remained unwavering, its routines continuing irrespective of who occupied its cells or commanded its gates. And within that rhythm, something unexpected emerged. A perception of the medieval world that is quieter, more human, and more intricate than the widespread legends of brutality or dread might suggest. A world where fortitude flourished in obscurity, where ordinary individuals, encompassing guards, clerks, and prisoners, each contributed to a daily existence that, while arduous, never truly ceased. Because even here, at the lowest stratum of the castle, the human spirit discovered avenues for sustenance. As the nighttime hours fully enveloped the dungeon, the atmosphere underwent changes that were initially almost imperceptible. The air, already cool, became slightly denser, as if the very stones absorbed the silence from above. The faint vibrations generated by footsteps, conversations, and movement within the castle faded to almost nothing. What persisted were the sounds intrinsic to the underground realm itself, the soft dripping of water finding its way through ancient mortar, the gentle rustle of straw as an inmate repositioned themselves for greater comfort, the distant murmur of wind traversing narrow ventilation shafts. Night within a medieval dungeon was characterized by a distinctive stillness. Even the guards spoke less, their voices subdued by the natural quietude that descends with darkness. Their lanterns cast warm pools of light that moved slowly across stone hallways, forming luminous arcs that glided over iron bars before vanishing once more. For prisoners, this glow sometimes represented the sole alteration in the sensory environment, a transient, gentle confirmation of humanity's continued presence nearby. Nevertheless, the darkness conferred a different kind of clarity. Absent distractions, individuals began to observe the minute details of their surroundings with heightened acuity. The manner in which moisture coalesced along the ceiling, forming droplets that faintly glimmered in the lantern light. The subtle thermal shifts resulting from cooler external air filtering downwards. The mild, earthy scent that seemed more pronounced at night when the air grew placid. Some inmates would close their eyes not to sleep. but to concentrate on memories that felt more vivid in the quietude. Visages of family members, scenes from childhood, the warmth of sunlight on open fields, the recollection of a bustling marketplace alive with color and sound. These reminiscences, whether comforting or tinged with melancholy, helped transform the quiet hours into something more endurable. Others maintained their connection to the world above through silent observances. A whispered prayer offered not in desperation, but as a means of temporal demarcation, a brief phrase repeated like a mantra to steady one's thoughts. Even simple breathing patterns served as grounding mechanisms. Slow inhalations, deliberate exhalations, establishing a cadence where none existed. Guards, too, perceived the nightly atmosphere distinctively from that of the day. They became more keenly aware of their responsibilities, recognizing that the dungeon depended entirely upon them during these hours. Their footsteps adopted a measured rhythm as they conducted their patrols, touching the cold metal of door hinges to confirm their security, pausing briefly at each cell to listen for indications that all was in order. The nighttime guard duty involved less an assertion of authority and more the preservation of fragile stability in a location where silence could otherwise become overwhelming. It was during the night that the dungeon's architecture revealed its subtle ingenuity. Medieval builders constructed subterranean spaces with remarkable care. The curvature of the ceiling assisted in redistributing the load from the castle above, fostering a sense of refuge even within confinement. Drainage channels were meticulously carved with gentle slopes that directed incoming water toward lower chambers, thereby preventing self-flooding. Ventilation shafts, though narrow, were precisely aligned to permit slow yet consistent air movement. These engineering decisions mitigated the harshness of the environment, preserving a form of equilibrium conducive to long-term survival. As the deepest hours of the night elapsed, some prisoners succumbed to sleep, not due to comfort, but from the weariness engendered by prolonged periods of waiting, hoping, and contemplation. Sleep in a dungeon was superficial and easily disrupted. The sound of a guard adjusting their lantern, a distant metallic clang, the soft creak of wood expanding or contracting with temperature variations. Nevertheless, even fragmented repose enabled individuals to confront the ensuing day with a marginal increase in mental clarity. Eventually, faint indications of morning began to manifest. Not with sunrise, as most prisoners would have no direct view of natural light, but through subtle shifts in sound and airflow, the rumbling of wagons entering the castle courtyard, the call of an individual commencing their labor overhead, the soft clatter of distant doors being opened for the day's duties. For prisoners, these served as gentle reminders that the daylight world continued to exist, even if they could not directly perceive it. That contrast between the hushed depths and the vibrant life above defined the entire dungeon experience. It established a layered perception of time, one that progressed slowly underground while accelerating in the external world. Days unfolded differently based on one's vantage point, and these transitions between night and day underscored the peculiar paradox of dungeon existence, confined yet never static, silent yet replete with subtle motion, isolated yet still connected by the reverberations of a world that persisted. And through this cadence, both incarcerated individuals and their keepers discerned a fundamental aspect of the medieval confinement experience. It wasn't merely the rigors, but the serene perseverance that permeated each hour. The manner in which the human psyche adjusted to obscurity, the way people ascribed significance to minute variations in sound or temperature. The fortitude that arose not from dramatic occurrences, but from navigating a realm defined by masonry, silence, and the unhurried progression of imperceptible seasons. The oubliette, despite its formidable challenges, unveiled dimensions of medieval existence seldom depicted in historical accounts or romantic tales. It served not solely as a site of chastisement, but as an arena where quotidian human experiences unfolded discreetly, shaped by its construction, established practices, and the steady beat of time just beyond reach. As daybreak fully permeated the upper echelons of the fortress, the dungeon received its own interpretation of dawn, one not composed of sunlight, but of human vitality returning to the world above. Wardens commenced their diurnal obligations with a subtle familiarity that indicated they had traversed these identical passageways countless times. Their footfalls carried a perceptibly more buoyant rhythm than during their nocturnal patrols, as if the overarching daylight imbued them with a slight surge of vigor. The reverberation of leather soles on stone preceded them, heralding the commencement of another day. The initial endeavor each morning involved assessing the structural soundness of the subterranean chambers. Medieval architects comprehended that humidity, ground displacement, and thermal variations could subtly impact the structural integrity of stonework. Guards would pause at designated junctures, pressing their palms against walls to detect any undue dampness or warmth. Periodically, they would tap gently with wooden implements to discern changes in resonance. This was a time-honored method of verifying whether mortar had deteriorated overnight. These modest acts of vigilance preserved the structural integrity of edifices designed to endure for centuries. A dungeon morning possessed its own tranquil cadence. Ventilation shafts conveyed downwards the faint fragrance of bread being prepared in the castle kitchens. To an individual located beneath, this aroma might drift in as a nebulous, comforting warmth, a reminder that ordinary life persisted above, defined by routines entirely dissimilar to those within the dungeon. Occasionally, the attenuated sound of a cartwheel or a stable attendant calling to horses would permeate, softened to near imperceptibility by its passage through walls and corridors. These minor sensory infiltrations aided prisoners in orienting themselves, offering fleeting glimpses of a world that continued to revolve. Guards frequently utilized the early hours to update their records. Medieval record-keeping was more elaborate than many assume. Ledgers documented prisoner arrival dates, outstanding dues, specific directives from nobility or judiciary, and even occasional annotations regarding conduct or health. Some guards took quiet satisfaction in the elegance of their penmanship, forming meticulous characters under the illumination of lanterns as they worked at unadorned wooden desks situated in alcoves. Their efforts brought a measure of order to an environment characterized by stone and silence. For the inmates, the morning introduced a distinct set of perceptions. The air, perpetually cool, felt marginally more invigorating following a night of repose. The subtle alteration in air circulation suggested that new streams had begun permeating the ventilation apparatus, agitated by the activity overhead. Certain prisoners assumed an upright posture, extending limbs that had stiffened during repose. Stretching served as both a physiological necessity and a mental exercise, a means of acknowledging the nascent day, even within confinement. A small contingent of prisoners adhered to their own internal morning regimens. One might etch a modest emblem upon the ground, a gesture inherited from familial customs or religious observances. Another might silently recapitulate a series of recollections, a strategy for maintaining mental equilibrium. Yet another might softly hum an almost inaudible melody from their youth, allowing the notes to resonate gently against the stone. These practices were unpretentious yet significant, fostering continuity from one day to the next. Guards sometimes exchanged brief verbalizations with prisoners during their morning patrols, not extended dialogues in the conventional sense, but concise acknowledgments, inquiring about the need for water, asking if the night had passed without incident, ensuring no one appeared unwell. These fleeting exchanges contributed to preserving a sense of humanity within an environment that might otherwise seem divorced from the wider world. As the morning advanced, soft shafts of indirect light occasionally graced the uppermost sections of the dungeon through angled passages. These were not direct sunbeams, but reflections, light rebounding off stone corridors before making its way into the deeper recesses. Yet even these faint glimmers could perceptibly alter the ambiance, illuminating the rough textures of the walls and imbuing them with subtle chromatic variations. Stone that appeared uniformly gray in darkness revealed undertones of brown, green, or muted ochre in this gentle, reflected luminescence. These areas were not designed for aesthetic appeal, yet their architectural design produced moments of understated elegance. The curvature of archways framed the reflected light in soft contours. Moisture adhering to the walls captured the light, transforming it into minute, glistening droplets. Even the ferrous fixtures, rings, hinges, and brackets acquired warm highlights when touched by the faint radiance. For the prisoners, these glimmers served as a reference point for internal temporal estimation. Lacking windows or timepieces, individuals relied on the natural cycles of light, sound, and air circulation to delineate the progression of hours. Over days, months, and at times years, these minor environmental cues became intimately familiar. A prisoner could often approximate the time solely by the timbre of distant footsteps, the angle of reflected light, or the aroma of activities conducted within the castle above. Notwithstanding the limitations and hardships, the dungeon was not an environment devoid of significance. Human intellects populated the space with memory, imagination, and subtle interpretation. Individuals perceived patterns in the dripping of water, constructing narratives around its rhythm. They attended to the distant sounds of diurnal labor and envisioned the scenarios unfolding above. They traced contours within the stone's texture, discovering symbols, fauna, or designs resembling landscapes or celestial arrangements. Through these tranquil actions, they carved out small enclaves of humanity within a realm defined by incarceration. Concurrently, the guards continued their morning duties with practiced proficiency. They replaced depleted lanterns with freshly filled ones, their new flames casting more consistent illumination along the passageways. They examined the locks with deliberate care, ensuring the mechanisms operated smoothly. They inspected the drainage conduits, clearing away any detritus accumulated overnight. The maintenance procedures were more than mere tasks. They were essential for maintaining the dungeon's functionality and averting the gradual degradation that could jeopardize safety. As the morning transitioned into midday, the dungeon resettled into its characteristic equilibrium. The air retained its cool steadiness. The stone absorbed the quiet activity and held it with stoic patience. Time continued its slow, layered progression, distinct above ground, distinct below, yet invariably advancing. Within this confluence of architecture, human presence, and the silent persistence of natural forces, a medieval dungeon revealed its complete complexity. It was a place fashioned by meticulous engineering, sustained by routine, and inhabited by individuals navigating the nexus of adversity and resilience. And throughout it all, morning, midday, nightfall, the dungeon remained a space that demanded fortitude, keen observation, and a quiet form of strength from all within its confines. By the time noon fully settled across the castle grounds, the dungeon had entered one of its most distinctive phases, a tranquil interval where external activity diminished, and the subterranean spaces felt almost suspended in time. The faint noises that drifted downward during the morning hours became more attenuated. Above, individuals were occupied with their diurnal responsibilities, yet the rhythms of that labor rarely penetrated the deepest chambers. This stillness was not vacant. It possessed its own character, a kind of serene density that accumulated between the stones. The temperature remained constant, insulated from the heat rising externally. Air moved gently through narrow passageways, creating soft currents that brushed against the walls and caused lantern flames to flicker in slow, wavering patterns. These subtle shifts in illumination produced an ever-changing interplay of brightness and shadow, as if the dungeon were inhaling in long, measured cycles. For guards stationed below, midday offered a brief respite. They would sometimes lean quietly against the stone, easing their weight for a moment before resuming their patrols. Their armor settled with a soft clink, echoing faintly off the walls. Some guards exchanged a few muted words, barely above a whisper, respecting the acoustics of the environment. They spoke of weather, harvests, or minor occurrences from the morning, ordinary subjects that introduced elements of normalcy to an otherwise austere setting. In these instances, the inherent humanity of the place manifested most clearly. Despite the dungeon's popular reputation, it was a place of employment for many of the personnel who served there. They were intimately familiar with its architecture, knowing which flagstones creaked more noticeably, which corners retained drafts, which lanterns burned with greater rapidity. Generations of guards passed down their knowledge, fostering a quiet lineage of familiarity within the stone. For prisoners, midday could represent a period of profound introspection. With fewer external sounds to divert their attention, their focus frequently turned inward. Some engaged in silent contemplation, concentrating on their respiration or on memories from their earlier lives. Individuals murmured tales, invocations, or treasured maxims under their breath, straightforward grounding practices that aided in preserving mental lucidity. A select few observed the cadence of water droplets descending from overhead arches into nascent pools, employing that rhythm to measure time or pacify agitated thoughts. The human psyche exhibits remarkable adaptability. Even within an environment characterized by constraint, people discovered patterns, rhythms, and structures to cling to. An inmate might intently listen to the gradual ebb and flow of atmospheric currents from above, treating it as a marker of passing hours. Another might meticulously examine the faint glint of light on the opposing wall, committing to memory how its position altered throughout the day. Over the passage of time, these minor observations evolved into cherished companions, forging a personal connection with the very space. Concurrently, on the surface, the castle continued its vibrant activity. Dispatches were conveyed, strategies deliberated, verdicts rendered. Some of these resolutions directly impacted the subterranean holding. Temporary detentions were sanctioned, paperwork processed, or directives dispatched downwards, affixed with a rudimentary wax seal impressed upon parchment. Upon their arrival, these communications brought with them the gravity of the external world, serving as a reminder to the underground chambers that they were an integral component of a vastly larger framework. Approaching mid-afternoon, a subdued murmuring occasionally ascended through the corridors, carried by fluctuating air currents. While not discernibly speech, it carried the impression of a distant tide of human endeavor. This subtle resonance served as a reminder that life continued above in all its intricate complexity. Bustling marketplaces, training grounds, active kitchens, and open courtyards. The dungeon resided beneath these strata, interconnected through its architecture, yet distinct in its ambience. The very stone appeared to react to temperature fluctuations above, expanding or contracting in ways too minute to be visually perceived, but occasionally audible as faint, delicate clicks. Medieval artisans possessed an intimate understanding of stone's properties, selecting materials capable of enduring these shifts without fracturing. Their superior craftsmanship enabled these subterranean edifices to withstand centuries of seasonal transitions, conflicts, and repairs. A noteworthy characteristic of numerous dungeons was the presence of diminutive maintenance alcoves, tiny recesses or shelves utilized by masons and laborers during the initial construction phases. Although predominantly vacant, they emanated a sense of the builder's presence. Tool marks from chisels remained visible, and in rare instances, stonemasons etched small initials or emblems near their work areas. To a discerning observer, these details narrated the structure's genesis, the implements employed, the expertise applied, and the hands that molded the environment. As the afternoon advanced, the illumination reflected within the dungeon underwent further changes. The subtle golden hue characteristic of midday gradually cooled into a gentler, paler shade. Shadows gracefully elongated across the floor, extending towards archways and columns. The atmosphere remained cool, yet the minor alterations in color imparted the impression of a world preparing for another transformation. The dungeon existed in a nearly contemplative state, neither fully alert nor entirely at rest, but quiescent within its own timeless equilibrium. Inmates could perceive this shift independently of visual contact with the sky. Their internal chronometers, shaped by routine, sensory input, and prolonged observation, became acutely attuned to these transitions. A keen ear could distinguish disparities between midday and afternoon reverberations. Subtle variations in sound quality, air density, or the intonation of voices from the upper levels indicated that the day was commencing its gradual descent toward evening. In this manner, the dungeon evolved into its own distinct realm, its subtle seasons marked not by snowfall or rainfall, but by human movement, light refractions, air currents, and the resonant pulse of the stonework. The deeper hours of afternoon approached with a gentle mien, settling like a cool shroud over the chambers. And as that shroud descended, the subterranean spaces prepared once more for the extended passage into evening. As the afternoon deepened, the dungeon entered one of its most evocative phases. The ambient light from above, already diminished by the time it permeated these chambers, began to soften further, transforming the stone passageways into extended gradients of subdued gold and gray. Shadows receded into the recesses between columns. The cool atmosphere settled more resolutely, generating a crisp stillness that felt almost ritualistic. For the sentinels, this period signaled the commencement of subtle preparations. They inspected their torches, ensuring each wick was adequately supplied with oil to endure the forthcoming night. The gentle friction of metal lids being lifted, the soft clinking of glass, and the delicate gurgle of oil being decanted constituted a subdued ceremony. These sounds reverberated through the corridors, naturally integrating into the existing acoustic tapestry of the locale. Certain guards adjusted their cloaks and secured their accoutrements more firmly at their sides. They possessed an unparalleled comprehension of the dungeon's rhythm. The evening hours introduced modifications in mood and atmosphere. Nothing drastic occurred, but the shifts were significant and demanded vigilance. Above, the castle would soon transition into its nocturnal routines, and that transformation propagated downwards like a sluggish tide. Prisoners also sensed it. Even without a timepiece, a window, or a direct vantage point of the shifting heavens, they recognized the approaching evening through inherent bodily intuition. The air felt subtly altered, marginally denser, somewhat cooler, and more composed. Footfalls from the upper levels became more measured as the castle readied itself for the evening repast. Distant voices modulated in tone, not necessarily louder or softer, but conveying a different energy, as though the day itself were exhaling deeply. For some, this juncture presented an occasion for introspection. They would mentally revisit conversations from earlier in the day, contemplate decisions they had made, or simply gaze into the soft luminescence of the torches, allowing their thoughts to meander like dust motes suspended in the air. The pervasive quietude of the dungeon fostered a unique form of privacy, an environment wherein the mind could roam freely, even when the body remained confined. The architectural design played a crucial role in shaping these emotional cadences. Narrow passages, robust walls, and vaulted ceilings created acoustic properties that absorbed sound gently, retaining it rather than allowing sharp resonance. Even the most imperceptible movement, the rustle of fabric, the drip of water, the settling of stone, carried a certain weight within the prevailing silence. Medieval architects understood that subterranean chambers necessitated durability above all else, yet they likely never envisioned how their craftsmanship would influence the psychological ambience centuries later. Within certain fortifications, the late afternoon hours were when officials or scribes occasionally descended to deliver or retrieve documents. Their footsteps were lighter than those of the guards, and they brought with them the faint aroma of parchment and wax. These visits introduced an administrative element to the dungeon's existence, reminding all within its depths that it was not an abandoned space, but a functional component of the castle's intricate system. The dungeon was not a domain of disarray. It operated with established structure and defined purpose. Individuals above resolved disputes, issued mandates, and established temporal parameters. Those situated below enforced those decisions through a consistent cadence. This ordered nature imparted a degree of predictability to the dungeon, which for many incarcerated individuals offered a peculiar sense of stability. Consistent routines, mealtimes, inspections, and adjustments to lighting served to anchor the mind to tangible elements within a world defined by restriction. As daylight diminished overhead, atmospheric current patterns shifted once more. Cooler air descended, moving through narrow shafts with a soft, almost soothing whisper. Lantern flames flickered in response, momentarily elongating before returning to their steady luminescence. These minor atmospheric alterations signaled the certain approach of evening. The dungeon reacted not by becoming more ominous, but by growing quieter and more introspective. It was an environment that evolved with the passing hours, shaped by the exhalations of the castle, the pulse of human activity, and the perpetual patience of stone walls that had stood for generations. Imminently, the castle bells above would announce the onset of evening, a prolonged resonance that permeated every level of the fortress. And when those notes finally cascaded into the depths, the dungeon would undergo another transformation, embracing the tranquil, contemplative hours of night. When the castle bells finally chimed, their deep, resonant tones reverberating through layers of stone, the dungeon underwent a shift that was almost ceremonial. The vibration propagated downwards like a slow wave, washing over the walls, floors, iron bars, and lantern hooks. Even the air seemed to pause momentarily, acknowledging the transition. Evening had arrived. Above, the castle transitioned into its nightly routines. Kitchens preparing the evening meal, guards changing shifts, courtiers dimming hall torches and closing shutters against the cool wind. Below, the dungeon mirrored this transition with its own quieter cadence. Lanterns were checked anew, their light deepening from pale gold to a warmer, softer glow. The steady flames lent the subterranean spaces a calmer atmosphere, less stark than midday, more intimate than morning. Shadows stretched a little farther across the stone floors, pooling in doorways and corners, shaping the dungeon into a space that felt simultaneously expansive and confined. Guards patrolled their rounds with slower, more deliberate steps. Evening shifts tended to be less rushed. There were fewer interruptions from above, fewer administrative summons, fewer unexpected visitors. The dungeon became a somewhat self-contained world during these hours, possessing its own pace and sense of time. Some guards utilized these quieter moments to briefly lean against a wall, listening to the muffled hum of the castle settling in for the night. They adjusted the fastenings on their cloaks, guaranteeing warmth as the increased chill set in. The underground temperature seldom fluctuated drastically, yet minor shifts were adequate for experienced personnel to make ready. Inmates too sensed the alteration. Even without timekeeping devices, their bodies registered the decelerated pace of activity outside their cells, the slight dimming of illumination, and the way the dungeon's resonance seemed to contract. Evening introduced a distinct fusion of quietude and contemplation. Some remained seated, conserving heat. Others murmured to themselves, or traced the edges of stone blocks with their fingers, anchoring their thoughts to something palpable and concrete. In particular fortifications, sentries would open small apertures or grated openings to dispense evening water portions. The sound of water being poured, consistent, patterned, almost ritualistic, resonated softly from one passageway to another. These utilitarian instances, however modest, provided stability. They reminded everyone below that the dungeon was integrated into a functional establishment, not a derelict site forgotten by time. Architecturally, the dungeon appeared to respire differently during these hours. The vaulted ceilings captured lantern light in gentle curves, transforming rough stone into surfaces that reflected heat rather than fully absorbing it. Air circulation settled into a uniform, tranquil pattern. Warmer currents ascended subtly, while cooler ones flowed gently along the lower stonework. Medieval architects may not have intended these atmospheric effects, yet their construction influenced them nonetheless. Evening also brought a psychological lucidity. With the daytime clamor diminishing, thoughts meandered more freely. Some inmates revisited the events that brought them to this place, not with distress, but with a composed detachment that nighttime frequently bestows. Others transitioned into musings about kin, territory, obligations, or distant recollections. Strands of existence untouched by iron confines. The dungeon's quietude became a backdrop for personal introspection. Sentries as well often grew pensive. They navigated their duties with practiced serenity, lantern light grazing the edges of their armor. Many spent these periods not contemplating assignments or timetables, but simply heeding the faint jingle of metal, the distant murmur of the edifice above, the quiet rustle of fabric, the occasional gust of wind slipping through narrow ventilation shafts. This nocturnal rhythm engendered something uncommon in the medieval era, a locale where time felt protracted, hushed, almost paused. And as the sky above deepened to true night, the dungeon prepared to enter its most evocative stanza, a duration when light, temperature, and sound converged into a singular immersive tranquility that characterized existence beneath the castle. Soon the extended night would fully envelop the fortress, and the dungeon would once again transition into the tranquil durations that shaped the inner sphere of all who inhabited or served within it. Night descended upon the castle like a heavy velvet drape, extinguishing the final vestiges of twilight. Above the dungeon, torches were gradually put out, windows barred against the cold, and the din of diurnal activity faded into a subdued void. The world upstairs grew silent. Down in the dungeon, the transition was far more minute, yet undeniable. Lantern flames steadied now that the airflow had subsided. The golden luminescence deepened into something warm, consistent, and nearly tender, casting slow-moving shadows across the stone. The dungeon at night no longer conveyed the impression of a place defined by sharp angles and resounding corridors. It felt contained, insulated, and motionless. The air cooled marginally, not significantly, but sufficiently for breath to emerge slightly denser, and fingertips to detect the faint nocturnal chill clinging to the lower stones. Guards adjusted their cloaks with silent, deliberate gestures. Their armor no longer clinked audibly. Instead, each adjustment of posture produced a muted, almost reverent sound in the quietude surrounding them. This was the hour when the dungeon became introspective. With fewer obligations demanding their attention, the guards often permitted their minds to wander towards their personal lives. Families slumbering somewhere above, fields situated beyond the castle walls, memories of festivities or market days that seemed improbably distant from the subterranean calm. In these instances, the dungeon felt less like a place of employment and more like a distinct realm, governed by its own perception of time. Prisoners, too, felt the immensity of night. Some rested with their backs against cool stone, attending to the faint hum of lanterns and the steady cadence of distant footsteps. Others huddled beneath blankets or cloaks, conserving heat. Their respiration blended with the soft, ambient sounds of the dungeon, even, almost meditative. Contrary to popular conjecture, night within a medieval dungeon was not characterized by dramatic outcry or frenetic noise. For the most part, it was astonishingly quiet. The robust architecture, the arches, the passageways, the layered stone absorbed sound so effectively that even a hushed exchange in one cell often dissipated to silence before reaching the next. That softness rendered the environment curiously placid. Even the dripping of water, steady and rhythmic, acquired an almost melodic quality during the tranquil hours. The sound reverberated gently along the curved ramparts, creating a form of natural lullaby shaped entirely by stone and elapsed time. Some guards derived solace from this. During routine nocturnal patrols, they proceeded at a slower gait, lanterns casting gradual arcs of light upon rough floors. Their route led them past supporting columns, barred entrances, storage alcoves carved into the walls, and narrow ventilation shafts releasing cool air into the space above their heads. Night watch duty was not an imposition here. It was a solemn ritual, a practiced sequence of movements executed in serene, methodical silence. Every castle possessed its individual tradition for these hours. In some, guards made minor annotations on wooden tablets, noting the completion of each circuit. In others, a bell or small chime gently signified the hour. And in a select few notably well-ordered fortresses, guards exchanged brief written observations. Nothing momentous, merely particulars. Lantern wick trimmed, air cooler in the southern passage. No unusual noise. Minute details that illustrated the considerable care invested in maintaining areas few individuals ever witnessed. As night deepened, the lantern glow seemed to impart warmth to the stone itself. Shadows stretched comfortably across the floors, shaping recesses and alcoves into soft silhouettes. The dungeon verged on peacefulness, a place where the relentless progression of life above decelerated to a gentle pulse. This was the hour when the dungeon felt most like a realm suspended between earth and eternity. A place where nothing hastened, nothing hurried, and all simply existed. Soon the castle above would fully succumb to slumber, and the dungeon would enter the most tranquil, unhurried, and intimate segment of the entire day, the profound nocturnal hours when sound, remembrance, and atmosphere melded into an unbroken stillness. Midnight arrived discreetly in the dungeon. No bell marked the hour, no grand announcement emanated from above. Instead, the moment manifested itself in subtle alterations. The air settling into a cooler, more consistent temperature, the final reverberations from the upper levels completely fading, and an unmistakable shift in the dungeon's inherent rhythm. This was when the dungeon felt almost devoid of weight. Each lantern burned at its lowest intensity, emanating a steady amber radiance with soft halos encircling each flame. The light did not aggressively repel the darkness. Rather, it mingled with it, creating an ambiance reminiscent of twilight more than midnight. Shadows draped corners and archways like soft fabric folds, imbuing them with muted tranquility. The stone, slightly warmed by hours of torchlight and human presence, retained that heat, but radiated none. It simply existed, cool, unmoving, ancient. Sound grew infrequent. A guard's footsteps, previously distinct against the stone, were now absorbed by the environment until they were little more than a gentle pattern. The rustle of fabric, the brush of metal, a quiet exhalation. These sounds floated in the air like faint brushstrokes rather than disruptions. Should someone drop a keyring or a metal cup, it would echo significantly down the corridor, but such mishaps seldom occurred. Deep night fostered an unspoken code of circumspection. Movement slackened. Objects were held with greater deliberation. Even voices, when necessary, softened to a calm, measured tone. The dungeon was not dormant. Stone does not sleep, but it held its breath. Above ground, the castle would be colder now, with fireplaces burning low and servants long retired to their quarters. But underground, beneath layers of stone and earth, the temperature remained remarkably stable. This natural insulation meant that midnight in a dungeon often felt strangely uniform. Cool, yet not biting. Still, yet not devoid of life. For the prisoners who remained awake, this hour held its own significance. Some individuals experience a peculiar surge of energy at night. The mind becomes sharper, thoughts more vivid, memories more alive within the dungeon. This cognitive clarity often impelled prisoners to reflect deeply on their past. They replayed conversations, envisioned alternative paths not taken, recalled festivities, fields, the aromas of kitchens, details of ordinary life suddenly amplified by distance. The mind becomes its own lantern in the darkness. Others drifted in and out of light slumber, neither fully dreaming nor fully awake, caught in a gentle rhythm dictated by the low hum of the dungeon surrounding them. Their bodies found pockets of warmth beneath blankets or cloaks, and the inherent acoustic gentleness created a curiously soothing environment for repose. Even the guards settled into a steady tempo. Night shift guards were not agitated unless an anomaly occurred. The profound stillness provided them with a clear awareness of the entire space. They could discern if anything was amiss simply by listening. One sound out of place would immediately be noticeable. They patrolled their routes with practiced calm, their lanterns casting slow arcs of light as they moved past pillars and gated alcoves. They paused at checkpoints, occasionally resting a hand against the cool stone or adjusting their equipment. It wasn't exactly relaxation, but a quiet sense of belonging. A rapport with the dungeon forged over countless nights. These guards frequently knew the dungeon better than any architect. They were aware of where the air flowed most gently, where sounds echoed most strongly, where a lantern flickered at precisely the same hour each night due to a hidden draft. They understood the dungeon's disposition, how it sounded on rainy nights, its feel in winter, and how the shadows shifted differently in summer. The deep night unveiled these subtle truths. At such an hour, the dungeon almost seemed like a realm outside of time, much like the rest of the castle and the fields beyond. The entire medieval world had retreated into slumber, leaving only this tranquil chamber of stone and light behind. There was no haste, no distraction, no movement beyond what was necessary. Everything existed in a state of complete, unbroken stillness. However, this serenity was not destined to last indefinitely. Soon, a new phase, subtle yet unmistakable, would commence. The gradual transition toward dawn, heralding the dungeon's reawakening and the commencement of a fresh cycle. The initial indication of dawn within a medieval dungeon was never a visual cue of light. Lacking windows for sunlight to penetrate or a sky to display early colors, the sun might as well have been a mere legend down there. Consequently, the dungeon evolved to interpret mornings through alternative signals. Small, nearly imperceptible shifts that, once understood, became undeniable. It invariably began with sound. Not loud sounds, nor even intentional ones, but subtle alterations that infiltrated the mind before the ears fully processed them. Somewhere far above, in the quarters inhabited by servants, the earliest morning duties would commence. A wooden door would open softly. A bucket would be set down. Someone would walk across aged floorboards. These faint vibrations would propagate through the stone resonantly and muted, transforming into gentle tremors that descended like distant thunder, softened by layers of earth. The dungeon would reciprocate with its own quiescent response. The air would register a change, becoming infinitesimally cooler, yet also thinner, touched by the faintest stirrings of movement. This was not genuine ventilation in the modern sense, but rather a pressure shift originating from the upper world beginning its day. The stone would release some of the heat it had retained overnight, and the environment would settle into a more neutral state, preparing for the impending activities. Lantern flames would flicker for longer durations, subtly inclining towards drafts. Shadows would elongate in slow motion, stretching across the floor in diagonal patterns. For the guards, this was the period of internal recalibration. Naturally, the human body instinctively recognizes the approaching end of a night shift. Eyes grow heavier. Footsteps lose their earlier firmness, yet the mind becomes unusually keen in anticipation of the transition. Guards would attend to their lantern oil, adjust their belts, or pause briefly at their posts in a silent ritual of mental readiness. Some might stretch their hands near a torch to regain warmth. Others would lean lightly against a wall, not enough to truly rest, but merely to feel the grounding presence of the stone through their armor. The dungeon's architectural design facilitated this entire procedure. Many medieval dungeons were constructed with narrow ventilation shafts or conduits leading upwards, carved into the walls and ceilings. These were not refinements, but rather engineering necessities, ensuring the dungeon remained free of stagnant air to a hazardous degree. Through these small apertures, even the slightest environmental shifts would permeate the structure. As dawn approached, those conduits would convey the merest hints of the above-ground atmosphere. Cleaner, fresher, touched by early morning humidity. The difference was minuscule, so slight that an infrequent visitor might not perceive it at all. However, a long-term inmate or a guard who had spent years within this place could detect it instantly. This was the juncture when many prisoners would stir, not from awareness of the morning, but because the human constitution, even in the absence of sunlight, can perceive environmental rhythms. Some would shift beneath their coverings, seeking new positions. Others would slowly blink awake, uncertain of the elapsed time. A few would experience a fleeting clarity, characteristic of the period following a long night when the mind awakens before the body fully complies. Certain prisoners would whisper quiet supplications, using the nascent hour to fortify themselves. Others would simply observe their surroundings, appreciating the stillness before the full commencement of the day. This liminal period within the dungeon, the hour preceding a dawn that never arrives, was surprisingly placid, almost serene. A moment suspended between the profound silence of the night and the duties that the daytime would impose. It represented the closest the dungeon ever came to drawing breath. And as this transition became more pronounced, a solitary sound would ultimately shatter the stillness completely. The advancing approach of the daytime guards, their armor subtly rustling as they entered the lower levels. That sound signified the end of night within the dungeon. The day did not commence with sunlight in this subterranean realm. It began with keys. Long before footsteps were heard or voices reverberated through the corridor, there was that distinct metallic chime, the gentle clinking of several iron keys swaying together as a guard descended the stairwell. Initially subtle, akin to something brushing against armor, it became unmistakable once its rhythm was recognized. The keys denoted authority. They signified routine, and they proclaimed that whatever scant hours of fragile tranquility had existed overnight were now concluded. The guards proceeded with deliberate purpose, their boots striking the stone with a trained cadence. Their lanterns cast fluid shapes upon the walls, tall, slender silhouettes that elongated and contracted with their movements, imbuing the hallway with a soft, wavering illumination. For the prisoners, this was the moment when a vague sense of morning awareness solidified into something tangible. Even those who had not slept would awaken at this sound. Some would sit up slowly, their backs stiff from the cold. Others would rub their arms for warmth, or simply listen, awaiting comprehension of the day's potential character. Medieval dungeons adhered to routines, even if they lacked the structured nature of contemporary institutions. Much of it was contingent upon the governor, the guards on duty, the castle's requirements, or even the season. Yet one element was almost universal: the morning inspection. The guards seldom conversed during these early patrols. Silence facilitated a swifter and safer process. Dialogue was unnecessary. Instead, they moved from cell to cell, lanterns held high, scrutinizing each space with practiced gazes. They were not typically searching for escape attempts, but for indications requiring immediate attention. A prisoner who had fallen ill, someone who had remained motionless since the previous night, a broken chain, a damp section of wall in need of repair, or a bucket requiring replacement. Each of these details held significance because the dungeon, despite its association with neglect, ultimately served as an instrument of order. Disorder, even minor disruptions, could propagate into larger issues. Consequently, the morning round was conducted quietly, efficiently, and with an almost methodical precision. One could hear the adjustment of lantern hooks as guards angled them forward. The slight rustle of armor as a guard crouched to examine something would be audible. The sound of water dripping from the ceiling as the dungeon warmed by a fraction of a degree could also be detected. Once the inspection was concluded, the day's rhythm would fully engage. A wooden hatch above, typically connected to a service corridor used by castle staff, would open. A bucket of water would descend by rope. Occasionally the water was fresh. At other times it was not, depending on various factors: the weather, water levels in the well, who had performed the task, or simply the priorities of the household that day. Food would follow. It was not a substantial meal, nor even a course in the modern sense. It was the morning ration, a piece of bread, thicker on auspicious days, thinner when resources were scarce. Sometimes, a small measure of broth was provided. At other times, nothing more than a handful of grain softened overnight. Prisoners instinctively understood the rationing system. Complaining was futile. Requesting more was pointless. They simply accepted what was delivered and made it last to the best of their ability. Meanwhile, the dungeon as a physical entity was also gradually awakening. Stone walls would emit faint cracking sounds as they expanded from the night's chill. Moisture would drip more consistently as the air warmed. Dust, dislodged by activity from above, would drift downward in gentle spirals. The faint aroma of morning cooking fires, bread, smoke, herbs, would filter through ventilation shafts, a reminder that an entirely different world existed just a few floors away. Some prisoners would pause upon detecting this scent, not out of longing, but because it served as a reminder that time continued its progression, even within these confines. Guards, their alertness heightened after the initial inspection, might occasionally engage in hushed conversations. Seldom about the prisoners themselves, but rather about the weather, their assignments, who was on the next watch, or minor occurrences in the castle courtyard above. Their words would echo softly through the corridors, blending with the dungeon's intrinsic acoustics in a manner that lent every exchange a curiously distant quality. The morning hour also marked the commencement of specific administrative duties. A scribe might arrive with a small writing tablet to verify names or record condition reports. A messenger from the castle lord could descend to inquire about a particular prisoner. Occasionally, coins would be exchanged if families had made payments the preceding night. This early cycle of routine imposed structure upon a place that otherwise existed outside the normal flow of time. Within the dungeon, the days rarely varied significantly, but the mornings invariably signified a transition, a psychological boundary, and a reminder that the dungeon was not merely a void of darkness. It was integrated into a functioning medieval system. Once these ceremonies concluded, the dungeon transitioned into its daylight state, becoming more tranquil and predictable, yet never fully serene. It was an environment that never truly rested, only altered its level of quietude. Daytime within a medieval dungeon was an experience entirely distinct from anything experienced on the surface. It didn't register as day, nor did it feel like night. Instead, it resembled an extended temporal lull, an interim phase while the world continued its progress above. However, nothing within these confines moved unless absolutely necessary. After the morning rituals subsided, the guards adopted a more detached posture. Their footsteps receded into the upper corridors, their lantern beams diminished, and the dungeon reverted to its inherent state of subdued stillness. This was the period when inmates became acutely aware of how protracted a day could feel. When external elements like sunlight, timekeeping devices, conversation, and sensory input are removed, the human mind possesses very limited means of quantifying time. Minutes become elastic, and hours blur into one another. An entire afternoon might seem to stretch for a week, or conversely, feel like nothing at all. Numerous prisoners, when they later had the opportunity to discuss it, described this sensation as one of the most profoundly disorienting facets of dungeon existence. Down here, the very absence of events constituted the primary occurrence. Water droplets striking the stone floors resonated with greater clarity, establishing their own rhythmic cadence. The distant sounds of staff activity somewhere above, barely perceptible, seemed amplified. The subtle tremors transmitted through stone beams. Even the sound of one's own respiration, or the echoing of one's heartbeat in their ears, became surprisingly pronounced when all else was silent. Some inmates attempted to occupy their thoughts by revisiting memories. An afternoon from childhood, a dialogue from years past, the visage of a loved one, anything offering even a transient respite. Others concentrated on minor actions, counting breaths, tracing patterns in the dirt, stretching stiffened limbs, rearranging the straw underfoot. These were not pastimes, they were coping strategies. In circumstances devoid of activity, one had to invent personal temporal markers to avoid losing all sense of continuity. The dungeon's atmosphere underwent subtle changes throughout these hours. The air grew heavier as humidity levels increased. Condensation formed on the walls, eventually descending in irregular rivulets. Shadows shifted as the lanterns overhead were repositioned or extinguished. Occasionally, dust from the upper levels drifted down through shafts, settling in thin layers on the floor, and the pervasive cold remained constant. It wasn't the sharp, biting cold of winter winds, but a deep, consistent chill emanating from the stone, an unvarying cold that insidiously permeated skin and reached the bones. Prisoners wrapped their arms around themselves or assumed a fetal position in an effort to conserve body heat. Even those bound by shackles learned to strategically shift their weight to momentarily cease shivering. If a prisoner shared the space with others, the daytime hours influenced their interactions. Groups developed unspoken understandings. Some engaged in hushed, cautious conversations, exchanging narratives or simply acknowledging each other's presence. Others remained isolated, either too wary or too fatigued to speak. Tensions could also escalate. The profound silence amplified irritations. Minor disputes regarding personal space, food remnants, or posture assumed amplified significance. Within the monotony, every element felt magnified, weightier, and more intensely personal. Meanwhile, guards would occasionally traverse the corridor, not to converse or engage, but to assert their presence. The faint clinking of their armor accompanied their steps, and their iron keys swayed once more. A beam from a lantern would sweep across the cells like a slender golden line before vanishing just as swiftly. These brief interruptions served as a dual reminder to the prisoners that they were not entirely forgotten, and that they possessed no agency over their circumstances. This was perhaps the most cruel paradox of dungeon life. Time advanced with agonizing slowness for the inmates, yet they lacked the power to influence its passage. There were no assigned tasks, no obligations, no choices to make. Time was not theirs to command, it simply happened to them. At infrequent intervals, an administrative event would disrupt the pervasive sameness. A messenger might arrive with inquiries. A scribe might update a record. A priest might descend with hushed footsteps and a low voice. Each visitation served a distinct purpose, yet all initiated a tremor of apprehension, because any deviation from routine in a place governed by silence was inherently unpredictable. Food was not provided again for a considerable time, and even then, its arrival was not always punctual. Consequently, during these languid hours, hunger would gradually emerge. It was a quiet hunger, not dramatic or overwhelming, but persistent, akin to a small weight pressing on the stomach throughout the day. By midday, the dungeon felt entirely severed from reality. One could not feel the sun. It was impossible to ascertain whether clouds obscured the sky or if it was clear. There was no perception of heat or breeze. One existed in a suspended realm of stone, dampness, and immobility, where each hour passed without leaving any discernible mark. Some prisoners attempted to sleep through the day. Others found sleep elusive, even when profoundly fatigued. The silence was too oppressive, the floor too uncomfortable, and the cold too intrusive. Throughout all of this, the dungeon itself seemed to possess a form of slow, geological life. Walls settled, beams emitted faint creaks. Water flowed through channels long since carved, and the space seemed to breathe in its own peculiar manner. By the time afternoon began to recede, assuming one could even perceive such a transition, many prisoners felt mentally depleted, despite having engaged in no physical activity. The protracted hours were not restorative. They were emotionally taxing, stretching the mind in ways that humans are not inherently equipped to withstand. However, as the day gradually started to transition towards evening, the prisoners were aware that the quiet would not persist indefinitely. Night introduced different sounds, different perils, different rhythms, and as the lanterns above began to cast a slightly warmer glow, signaling the approach of those later hours, the dungeon prepared for another transformation. Nightfall within a medieval dungeon did not occur in the same manner as it did above ground. There was no sunset, no gradual fading of orange light, no progressive dimming. There was merely a subtle alteration. It was so subtle that one might overlook it if not paying close attention. A guard's lantern would dim slightly. A particular corridor would fall quieter. A distant hallway door would be secured for the evening. Air currents would slow almost imperceptibly. and this was sufficient to alter the entire ambiance. Night within a dungeon was not characterized by increased darkness, but by a heightened sense of oppression. It descended upon the prisoners like a dense shroud of uncertainty. The sounds were the first to change. Activity on the surface ceased as castle inhabitants retired for the night. The blacksmith's hammer fell silent. The courtyard emptied. Merchants and visitors departed. Even the guards changed shifts, leaving extended periods where the sound of footsteps became infrequent. These sonic voids created an unsettling quietude. Prisoners would unconsciously hold their breath, listening for any indication that the world beyond continued its functioning. However, the dungeon absorbed sound more readily than it produced it. At times, the only audible noises were the slow drip of water, the rustle of straw as a prisoner shifted position, a quiet exhalation from someone attempting to sleep, or the distant muffled clatter of a chain settling into a new configuration. If one listened intently, it was possible to discern the stone itself expanding with falling temperatures and contracting in other areas. The floor beneath one's feet transmitted faint vibrations from the structure adjusting, almost as if the dungeon possessed its own latent pulse. Night also altered the character of the air. It became colder, noticeably so, and somehow more stagnant. One could almost taste the dampness, a mineral-rich coolness that settled in the lungs and lingered there. For some prisoners, the nights were the most arduous period. The brain, having been deprived of stimulation throughout the day, became exceptionally active when left in solitude in the darkness. Thoughts grew louder, fears intensified, and regrets resurfaced. The absence of external sensory input caused the mind to fill the void with whatever it could access. A prisoner who maintained composure during the day might experience their heart rate accelerate at night. Another who conserved energy might feel an inexplicable urge to pace if not restrained. An individual who had remained silent for days might whisper into the darkness simply to hear their own voice, to affirm their continued existence. If a cell housed multiple prisoners, this was when the group dynamics underwent the most significant shift. Some huddled together for warmth, others exchanged hushed stories or prayers. Many withdrew inward, remaining silent for extended periods. Occasionally, a prisoner would awaken from a semi-conscious dream and mistake shadows on the wall for movement. The mind, lacking external reference points, began to fabricate its own. This was not delusion, but rather the brain's attempt to establish a sense of grounding. Night was also when apprehension regarding the unknown escalated. Prisoners never knew who might approach after dark. A guard conducting a late patrol, a messenger bearing orders, a priest seeking a specific individual, or perhaps no one at all, which was sometimes the most unnerving possibility. The inherent unpredictability rendered every minor sound significant. A soft contact of stone, the scuttling of a rat, the approach of a guard, a prisoner stirring in the adjacent cell, a loose iron ring settling in its bolt, or simply the dungeon exhaling once more. For inmates awaiting judgment, night was when their imagination became their most formidable adversary. Questions permeated the darkness. Would tomorrow bring a resolution? Would a visitor appear? Would their situation be overlooked? Would freedom or sentencing be pronounced? Time felt distinct during these hours. The already slow pace of the day seemed to decelerate further, elongating into something thin and nearly invisible. It was impossible to measure, impossible to anticipate. All that could be done was to endure it. Some prisoners attempted to sleep, while others found it unattainable. Sleep was erratic, sometimes arriving abruptly, at other times never materializing at all. And then, in the most peculiar manner, the dungeon seemed to achieve a state of tranquil accord, as if every element simultaneously held its breath. Stone surfaces absorbed the warmth radiating from bodies and lanterns, the air grew heavy, and the silence intensified. Even the sounds of footsteps from above became infrequent. This was the heart of the night, the dungeon's most introspective period, when the world on the surface truly slumbered, and the world beneath existed in a realm outside of time, neither fully alive nor entirely deceased. When dawn eventually approached, not heralded by sunlight, but by subtle shifts in distant activity, inmates frequently felt as though an entire epoch had elapsed during the night. Yet nothing had fundamentally changed. They remained in the same confinement, still awaiting, still heeding, still persevering. If the nights within a medieval dungeon illuminated the emotional facets of confinement, then sustenance and hydration served to reveal its physical constitution. These were the inherent rhythms, the forms of exchange, and at times, the sole indicators of time's passage. Provisions did not arrive according to a fixed timetable, as they do in contemporary times. Their arrival depended on when someone recalled, or when an individual had the leisure, or when a particular motive existed, whether for benevolence or severity. A captive might discern the echo of footsteps in a corridor and ponder whether it signified the hour for a meal or merely a guard traversing the passage. On occasion, days stretched so long that prisoners became convinced they had been forgotten, only for a latch to click and a small vessel to be nudged through an aperture moments thereafter. The fare itself was rudimentary to the point of being almost forgettable. Bread, frequently dry and coarse by the time it reached the subterranean levels. Thin, watery soup, occasional vegetables, typically those deemed unsuitable for sale elsewhere. Sometimes barley mixed with water, and at other times, absolutely nothing. Bread constituted the most prevalent item. Hard, dense, and minimally seasoned, it readily absorbed the ambient dampness. Inmates would slowly tear off pieces, both to prolong their ration and because consuming food rapidly served no purpose when the objective was to conserve energy rather than assuage hunger. The broth was often served lukewarm. Its heat dissipated for the most part between the kitchen and the dungeon. It was not unpleasant. It was simply thin, more liquid than substantial, yet warm enough to offer fleeting solace to hands chilled by the stone walls. Water presented its own set of uncertainties. It comprised rainwater collected in reservoirs during inclement weather, well water transported down in heavy containers, the ropes emitting a high-pitched squeal with each ascent. Sometimes water flowed directly from subterranean conduits beneath the fortress, naturally purified by its passage through layers of earth and rock. It was not precisely invigorating water. It carried an earthy flavor, rich in minerals, cold enough to numb the palate upon the first taste, and occasionally imparted a slight metallic note. Nevertheless, it was water, and its mere presence rendered it invaluable. Prisoners quickly learned that water held greater importance than food. One could endure hunger and survive, but thirst exacerbated the passage of hours, intensified the density of the air, and heightened mental distress. The majority of inmates drank sparingly, cherishing each drop. Others consumed it rapidly, seeking immediate relief, even if it meant enduring greater hardship in the subsequent hours. The receptacles, bowls, and cups were simple, usually fashioned from wood. They absorbed surrounding moisture, expanding slightly over time and darkening with repeated use. Their rims softened from constant handling. They were light enough for easy transport, yet substantial enough to feel tangible in a place where few other things did. Sustenance was more than mere nourishment. It was a form of communication. A reduced portion conveyed a distinct message. At times, it indicated dwindling resources. On other occasions, it signaled a shift in a prisoner's standing. Sometimes it signified no more than a guard's momentary inattention. However, inmates seldom interpreted these changes as arbitrary. Their hunger was too profound for such assumptions. They sought out meaning wherever it could be found. Occasionally, a guard would pause for a moment while delivering provisions, offering a curt nod, a brief utterance, or even a silence that conveyed a certain tenderness. Such a minimal gesture could alter a prisoner's disposition for an entire day. Food could also be bartered, though not through formal channels, but via discreet understandings. An inmate with visiting family who brought occasional items might exchange a small piece of bread for assistance, intelligence, or simple fellowship. A prisoner who possessed literacy might offer that ability in trade to someone who lacked it. The most meager resources became integrated into a silent economy, measured not in currency, but in reliance, obligation, and shared adversity. On rare occasions, a celebratory event within the castle above led to an infrequent moment of surprise below. Leftovers, not the elaborate dishes, but the simplest remnants might find their way down. A fragment of softer bread, a piece of fruit, a vegetable from a stew. Such instances felt almost surreal, reminding prisoners that the world above adhered to cycles of festivity from which they were now excluded. And then there were days when no food arrived, not as a punitive measure, nor due to neglect, but simply because life in medieval times was inherently unpredictable. Storms, public holidays, unforeseen demands placed upon the castle's personnel. Any of these factors could disrupt the dispatch of meals to the dungeon. Prisoners endured these days with quiet fortitude, concentrating on conserving their strength and anticipating the return of normalcy. Some dungeons possessed a solitary water source, a small basin or cistern hewn directly into the stone. It would replenish slowly through subterranean percolation, providing prisoners with a limited supply that remained cool throughout the year. The sound of dripping water striking the surface became familiar, almost a source of reassurance. Provisions and water influenced every aspect of their existence, not due to their abundance, but because they were just sufficient to remind prisoners that survival progressed gradually, silently, in ways that demanded patience rather than defiance. Meals were not moments of gratification. They were reminders that existence persisted even in the absence of comfort, that the body adapted even when circumstances did not, and that prisoners, notwithstanding their environment, maintained routines that served as their anchor. Ultimately, food and water were not the defining features of their imprisonment. They were, however, the points of stability, daily markers that propelled time forward in a place where it often felt suspended. Time within a medieval dungeon did not progress in the same manner as it did on the surface. Days did not unfold through the progression of sunlight and activity. Nights did not announce themselves through encroaching darkness. They were perpetually enveloped in darkness. Instead, time became fluid, indistinct, and altered in its texture. And within that peculiar setting, prisoners established routines. Not because they operated on schedules, but because routines represented one of the few means of preserving their humanity in a world deliberately designed to strip it away. Most routines were minor undertakings. A prisoner might commence each morning, whatever a morning signified, by extending their arms or flexing their fingers, reaffirming to themselves that their body still functioned despite the pervasive cold and damp. They might touch the wall to assess the extent of moisture accumulation overnight. They might count their breaths to maintain composure. They might offer a silent prayer, not necessarily from profound piety, but from ingrained habit. These minute rituals evolved into anchors. Some prisoners devised methods to track the passage of time. They would engrave a small mark when sustenance was provided, or tap the stone floor after each measured portion of water, or utilize sounds emanating from above, such as footfalls, distant voices, or the clamor of cookware, to approximate segments of the day. Others found structure through discourse, provided they were not isolated. Two individuals sharing a cell might allocate specific periods for silence, others for conversation, and yet others for repose. Discussions transformed into narratives, reminiscences, reflections. Anything to impart form to hours that otherwise lacked definition. In certain detention facilities, prisoners established subtle communication channels. A cough executed with a particular cadence, a rap on a pipe, a whispered greeting through a fissure in the wall. Nothing ostentatious, merely straightforward affirmations of another human being's proximity. Respiration routines evolved into survival mechanisms. Deep inhalations to retain warmth, slow exhalations to preserve tranquility, rhythmic breathing to counteract panic during the nights when the silence felt suffocating. The psychological benefit derived from these routines was immense. Where the environment fostered a sense of monotony, routines fostered a notion of self. Where the dungeon negated structure, prisoners quietly reconstituted it, one small action at a time. Movement, even if restricted, also became a patterned activity. standing, followed by sitting, leaning, then stretching, traversing short circular paths when space permitted, touching the ceiling or walls to maintain muscular function. Some prisoners would softly hum old melodies to themselves, not loudly or assertively, but gently, akin to a parent soothing an infant. The melody itself was inconsequential. The rhythm was paramount. Memory similarly transformed into a distinct form of structure. Prisoners would mentally revisit narratives they knew. Childhood stories, family events, religious passages, replaying them deliberately as if turning pages that existed solely within the confines of their minds. Over time, this mental exercise could evolve into a sanctuary, a private inner space cultivated within a structure of stone. Inmates took note of subtle environmental shifts that individuals on the surface would scarcely register. The air's propensity to feel somewhat cooler on specific days. The faint aroma of impending rain, even when no daylight ever penetrated their enclosure. The distant resonance of a gate being opened overhead. The gentle vibrations of carts traversing the castle courtyard. The alteration in footfall patterns during periods of festivity or market days. These minor sensory cues became the closest approximation they had to a temporal record. Eventually, the physical body also adapted. Vision adjusted to the pervasive darkness. Skin grew accustomed to the cool stone surfaces. Muscles learned to conserve body heat through minimal, efficient movements. Hearing became more acute, transforming faint sounds into intimations of the external world beyond the confines of their cells. Adaptation did not equate to comfort, but it represented a crucial element for survival. A number of prisoners recounted in subsequent historical accounts how their dreams underwent a transformation. The longer their subterranean confinement persisted, the more vivid their dreams became, conjuring images of places they once knew. Sun-drenched meadows, flowing water, expansive skies, the scent of wood smoke. Dreams became a venue for temporary respite, a reminder of a world they aspired to rejoin. And through all these elements, a prisoner's mind continuously adapted. The initial days were characterized by comparison, reminiscing about freedom and acknowledging the deprivation. As time progressed, the focus shifted towards acceptance and conforming to new daily patterns. Ultimately, the mind's primary objective became achieving equilibrium, preserving one's self-identity while adjusting to restricted circumstances. Some inmates even reported experiencing moments of peculiar tranquility. This was not due to benevolent conditions, but rather because the established routines offered small pockets of stability amidst a turbulent environment. In a way, adaptation represented the silent triumph of those confined beneath the earth. It was not overtly dramatic or heroic. Instead, it was a manifestation of human resilience through the most minimal actions. Nothing extraordinary occurred, only a succession of deliberate choices that conveyed, "I persist, I remain myself. I have not been consumed by the darkness." Within a world engineered to suppress them, this constituted a significant victory. When one envisions a medieval dungeon, a rudimentary pit in the ground might come to mind, excavated with minimal effort and maintained with even less care. However, the reality was considerably more calculated. These enclosures were constructed not by chance or negligence, but with the express purpose of fulfilling a specific function: containment, not comfort or correction. Containment. A dungeon was more than just a dark chamber. It was an extension of the fortress above. It served as an instrument of governance, a tangible representation of authority, and a stark message etched in stone about the distribution of power. The architectural design clearly reflected this aim. The first element a prisoner would perceive, even before reaching the dungeon itself, was the descent. The downward path invariably felt longer than anticipated, featuring sharp turns, confined staircases, and winding corridors that obscured one's bearings. These passageways were not intended for ease of movement. Their purpose was to disorient. Each bend, turn, and sudden drop compelled a prisoner to relinquish their sense of direction. Even if blindfolded or in total darkness, the very architecture rendered escape inconceivable. On the surface, a person can discern the horizon. Below ground, no such reference point exists, only stone. The doors separating sections of the dungeon were another deliberate design feature. These were thick, reinforced structures, engineered to withstand pressure and absorb sound. Many incorporated multiple layers, with wood reinforced by iron and set within stone frames. The clearances around these doors were intentionally minimal, impeding sound travel. A prisoner shouting for aid would hear their own voice more distinctly than anyone above could. Ventilation shafts, where present, were narrow and angled, designed to ensure air circulation without providing viable escape routes. These shafts typically widened only near the upper terminus, close to the surface, preventing passage by any human form. Any sound ascending would dissipate within these angled conduits, fracturing into faint whispers long before reaching the open air. The construction of the walls was executed with exceptional precision. This was not a haphazard assembly of rough stones, but tightly fitted blocks designed for uniform weight distribution. The builders understood the imperative of structural integrity for subterranean constructions, particularly beneath substantial castles. The outcome was walls that were solid, thick, and remarkably quiet. Even when pressed against them, they absorbed sound rather than reflecting it, intensifying the sense of isolation. Voices did not rebound, and footsteps did not echo. Every sound seemed to be absorbed by the stone. The placement of cells within the dungeon was equally intentional. Cells were often situated near corners or in deep interior sections, rather than along straight corridors. Consequently, even if a prisoner managed to open a cell door, they would be confronted with curves, dead ends, or changes in elevation, a labyrinth designed to confuse. Some dungeons even featured subtle floor gradients, so slight as to be consciously unnoticed, yet sufficient to influence water flow or the sensation of walking. These inclines guided movement, channeling rainwater towards drainage systems or away from specific areas. From the perspective of the castle designers, nothing within the dungeon occurred by accident. Ceilings were kept low. This was not solely a measure to conserve materials, but functioned as a psychological tactic. A diminished ceiling height engendered a sense of confinement, heaviness, and oppression. In certain cells, prisoners could not stand fully upright, necessitating constant postural adjustments. This physical restriction conveyed a clear message. This space was not intended for comfort. Even the illumination, or its lack, was a calculated element of the experience. Dungeons were not lit for the inmates, they were lit for the guards. Torches were positioned near entry points or along guard patrols, not adjacent to the cells themselves. Light was a controlled commodity, with most of it failing to penetrate the interior spaces where individuals were held. This resulted in prisoners existing in perpetual twilight or near complete darkness, while guards maintained visibility. Some of the more progressive builders incorporated acoustic principles into their designs. Long before the formalization of acoustics, masons understood the behavior of sound in enclosed environments. They constructed walls and corridors that attenuated noise, ensuring that even significant disturbances did not travel far. This represented architectural psychology predating the very concept. However, perhaps the most striking feature was the seamless integration of dungeons into the castle's defensive framework. They were situated in sections least susceptible to attack, typically beneath robust walls or towers, where stone collapse under siege was improbable. This ensured the prisoner's security even during times of castle vulnerability. This integration also meant that dungeon entrances were positioned for maximal guard control. There were choke points, narrow doorways, and bottleneck staircases, locations where a single guard could impede all movement. Should an escape attempt be made, these architectural impediments would be encountered long before any actual guards. Despite all these features, dungeons were not uniform. Regional variations, distinct castles, and different centuries introduced design modifications. Some dungeons comprised multiple levels, with upper holding areas and deeper, more restrictive lower sections. Others contained only a single floor, carved directly into bedrock. Some were arid and dusty, while others were damp, connected to natural springs or subterranean water tables. Nevertheless, the underlying purpose remained constant. These spaces were never constructed for comfort, rehabilitation, or instruction. They were built for containment, in both the literal and psychological senses of the word. Viewing them not as random medieval artifacts but as engineered environments reveals that a dungeon was more than merely a location. It was a system. It was a structure designed to eliminate choices, erode confidence, and render the external world impossibly distant, regardless of its proximity. This is why, centuries later, entering a preserved dungeon still induces a shiver. While the architecture may be ancient, the intent imprinted on every stone is unmistakable. To truly comprehend the life within a medieval dungeon, one cannot focus solely on the prisoners. Beneath every dungeon, every decision, every locked door, and every hour spent in darkness, existed another group of individuals whose lives were equally defined by those stone walls. These were the guards, not the heroic figures of popular narratives or the proud soldiers featured in processions. The existence of dungeon guards unfolded in a realm parallel to the surface, yet perceived as entirely separate. Their lives transpired within the same frigid corridors, under the same dim torchlight, and amidst the same echoing silence that shaped the experiences of the prisoners. A guard's day commenced early, well before sunlight illuminated the upper courtyards. They would descend the narrow staircases with a blend of resignation and ingrained habit, carrying torches whose flames wavered and flickered in the stagnant air. Some guards undertook dungeon duty voluntarily, attracted by the prospect of regular employment and pay. However, many were assigned out of necessity. While not a prestigious position, it provided employment, which was sufficient for some men. Above ground, they were unremarkable. Below ground, they wielded authority. A guard's responsibilities extended far beyond preventing escapes. They served as record keepers, ration administrators, maintenance supervisors, and liaisons between the incarcerated and the outside world. Each morning, guards verified the security of cell doors, conducted prisoner counts, and documented any changes in health or demeanor, not out of empathy, but to maintain order. Their duties included escorting prisoners to tribunals, conveying messages for those with external connections, and ensuring the adherence to fundamental routines. However, the most defining aspect of their role was their constant presence. They were invariably there, in a space where the passage of time seemed to cease. Contrary to common perception, dungeon guards did not perpetually patrol the halls or issue loud commands. More frequently, they occupied alcoves or held posts for extended periods of quietude. This monotony was arduous. Many guards spent so much time in dimness that their eyes became acutely sensitive to full daylight. Returning to the surface at the end of a shift could be disorienting, even painful. The emotional distance separating guards and prisoners varied considerably. Some guards maintained a professional demeanor, characterized by politeness and detachment, neither inflicting cruelty nor offering kindness. Others were more hardened, shaped by years of interacting with desperate individuals and enduring challenging circumstances. Then, there were the rare few who displayed sympathy, providing an extra portion of bread or engaging in brief conversations with those in need. Nevertheless, in all instances, the guard's life was influenced by the same forces that impacted the prisoners: cold, damp, silence, and isolation. The dungeon exerted a transformative effect on its inhabitants. Some developed an acute sensitivity to sounds: the drip of water, the distant clank of a chain, the rustle of movement in an adjacent cell. Others cultivated a profound internal fortitude against fear, as the dungeon brimmed with elements capable of unnerving even seasoned individuals. Unexpected echoes, peculiar drafts, and a pervasive sense of being observed, even during moments of absolute stillness within the cells. The guard's occupation also carried its own inherent anxieties. A sentinel who succumbed to sleep risked severe reprimand. A guard who misplaced a key, a record, or misinterpreted an order faced significant repercussions. Any error could result in financial loss, reputational damage, or demotion. Furthermore, because the majority of guards resided in close proximity to the castle or fortress, their communities maintained a keen awareness of their place of employment. While some families took quiet pride in their father's or son's trusted position, others harbored apprehension, not due to the dishonor of the work, but because the dungeon left indelible marks on individuals. A dungeon guard seldom spoke of his duties, not out of shame, but due to the inherent difficulty in articulating the experience. How could one convey the oppressive weight of silence? The sensation of descending each morning past stones worn smooth by countless generations of footsteps. The peculiar feeling that time itself flowed at a different pace beneath the earth. The men tasked with guarding prisoners navigated a liminal existence, belonging fully to neither realm. They shared their towns or villages with others, yet dedicated their days to spaces devoid of daylight and conventional life. This duality profoundly shaped their personalities, habits, and even their sleep patterns. Many guards cultivated a preference for dimly lit environments and tranquil evenings, a predilection that persisted long after they had left their posts. And despite wielding authority, they possessed an intimate understanding of a somber reality. In different circumstances, they could just as easily have found themselves on the other side of the bars. This awareness occasionally tempered their treatment of inmates, while at other times it hardened it. Dungeon guards were human beings, contending with an environment that relentlessly tested patience, empathy, and resilience. When we envision medieval dungeons, our focus often rests upon those confined within. However, those holding the keys tread their own arduous path through those frigid corridors, a journey marked by duty, routine, and the peculiar rhythms of a life lived between darkness and daylight. If you close your eyes and picture a medieval dungeon, darkness likely comes to mind first, perhaps coldness second. Yet in reality, one of the most defining characteristics of subterranean life was neither darkness nor temperature. It was sound, or more accurately, its profound absence. A dungeon possessed its own unique soundscape, one that dictated the passage of every hour for both prisoners and guards. Comprehending this soundscape offers a deeper insight into the authentic experience of these environments. The immediate shift in acoustics was the first sensation upon descending into a dungeon. Stone walls absorbed minimal sound, causing every minor movement to reverberate endlessly. The jingle of a key against a belt, a guard's footsteps on uneven flooring, a water droplet tracing its path down the wall before striking the ground. These sounds repeated in slow, measured cadences that marked the passage of time. For prisoners, these drips became temporal markers. A steady drip in a corner might echo every few seconds, while another might fall into a small pool with a delicate splash. After weeks or months, prisoners could discern the distinct patterns, as if the environment itself had acquired a voice. Subtle, yet undeniably present. On certain nights, drafts, funneled through narrow ventilation shafts, would produce faint melodies, soft whistles, or hollow hums that could evoke a sense of music or unease, depending on the listener's emotional state. Some historical accounts note prisoners who believed the dungeon itself was communicating with them. However, modern interpretations suggest they were processing natural sounds through the filters of fear, stress, and isolation. Then there were the subdued sounds from above. Life continued in the outer world. The rumble of carts in the courtyard, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer in the workshop, the low murmur of voices near a stairwell, the chime of church bells signaling morning, noon, or a festive occasion. These auditory cues filtered downwards, muted, as if originating from an entirely separate existence. For prisoners, these faint intimations of the world above could be either a source of comfort or torment, serving as reminders that life had not ceased simply because they had been removed from it. Within the dungeon itself, intercell communication presented challenges. Some cells were situated closely enough for prisoners to discern each other's breathing or shifting positions. Others were separated by formidable stone or thick wooden barriers, creating prolonged periods of silence that could foster extreme solitude. When communication did occur, it often took the form of tapping, a finger or knuckle against stone, employing learned and repeated patterns, a rudimentary language born of necessity. Even then, guards could frequently detect these taps, yet they often disregarded them unless they perceived a matter of significant importance. In a place characterized by routine, isolated taps were unlikely to disrupt the established order. Guards moved differently in their subterranean domain. Their pace slowed. Their movements became more deliberate, allowing their hearing to guide them. They could discern when a prisoner was restlessly shifting, pacing, or speaking softly to themselves. In an environment where every sound was amplified, prolonged silence carried its own implications. Excessive quiet could be as disquieting for a guard as excessive noise, prompting an inspection in either case. Night within the dungeon lacked the distinct character of night, as no direct light penetrated the cells. However, guards changed shifts. Torches were periodically dimmed and replaced, and air circulation altered with shifts in external temperatures. These subtle transitions established their own temporal markers for individuals unable to perceive the passage of day or night. Some prisoners described the dungeon as a sort of echoing chamber of introspection, as the pervasive quiet compelled them to confront every inner voice, every apprehension, every unresolved query. Modern psychologists might categorize this as a combination of sensory deprivation and environmental monotony, conditions known to enhance imagination and introspection. Yet, within the medieval context, prisoners interpreted these experiences through their existing frameworks: faith, superstition, and personal recollections. Some believed they heard the voices of loved ones calling from above. Others reported auditory hallucinations of familiar past experiences. Horses galloping, the ebb and flow of ocean waves, wind rustling through trees. These were likely the manifestation of memories replaying themselves in a mind starved for external stimuli. Nevertheless, to the prisoners, these impressions felt tangible, at least momentarily. The dungeon's soundscape, with its peculiar amalgamation of silence and echoes, profoundly influenced how individuals thought, slept, hoped, and endured. It was not overtly loud, violent, or chaotic. Instead, it was subtle, ever-present, and deeply psychological. In many respects, it constituted one of the most potent forces operating in the subterranean depths. While the soundscape defined the atmosphere of a medieval dungeon, its architecture dictated its function. These spaces were not conceived haphazardly, but were meticulously designed with specific purposes. Whether rudimentary or surprisingly sophisticated, their construction was always deliberate. To comprehend a dungeon, one must adopt the perspective of a medieval builder or warden, viewing it as a structure intended not solely to confine individuals, but to influence conduct, uphold order, and assert authority. Most dungeons were not independent edifices. Rather, they were integrated beneath larger structures such as castles, civic buildings, monasteries, or fortified residences. This integration was strategic, allowing the sheer mass of the overlying structure to bolster the security of the lower levels, both physically and symbolically. Being imprisoned beneath the very seat of power conveyed an overwhelming sense of unassailable authority. The initial aspect of design related to the approach. Prisoners seldom entered through the same portals utilized by nobility, guards, or general visitors. Dungeons possessed their own distinct pathways: narrow staircases, low archways, and angled corridors that facilitated a gradual psychological transition as individuals descended. With each step into the subterranean realm, the air grew cooler, the light diminished, and the sounds of the surface world receded. By the time one reached the lowest level, they already felt profoundly detached from their former world. Doors represented another crucial design element. A medieval dungeon door was more than a mere barrier. It was a demarcation that controlled airflow, sound transmission, movement, and perception. The most prevalent design featured thick wooden planks reinforced with iron bands. Small apertures, no larger than a hand's span, might be incorporated into the center to facilitate the passage of food or to allow for a cursory inspection of internal conditions. These openings were intentionally diminutive, safeguarding guard personnel while restricting the prisoner's visual access to the exterior. Some doors lacked any openings whatsoever. In such instances, guards relied exclusively on auditory cues, listening for breathing, movement, or vocalizations to ascertain whether a prisoner was awake, asleep, or in need of attention. Within these cells, the concept of time became even more abstract for the occupants. Ventilation, though subtle, was indispensable. Medieval architects understood the necessity of air circulation, even in the deepest chambers. Narrow shafts, often ingeniously concealed within the stone walls, facilitated a modest yet consistent flow of air. These were not designed for comfort, but out of sheer necessity. A single shaft might serve multiple cells, providing just enough fresh air to prevent asphyxiation. The resultant air currents produced faint drafts that shifted throughout the day, enabling prisoners to perceive meteorological changes they could not visually confirm. The configuration of cells varied considerably. Some were designed for single occupancy, offering just enough space for a person to sit or recline. Others were more capacious rooms where multiple individuals might be incarcerated concurrently, such as merchants, travelers, debtors, or villagers, awaiting the resolution of local disputes. Shared spaces fostered their own dynamics, leading to conversations, tensions, alliances, and routines that arose from necessity rather than preference. Water management stood out as one of the most overlooked aspects of dungeon architecture. Medieval engineers had to account for natural groundwater flow, rain infiltration, and drainage. Some dungeons featured stone channels carved into their floors, guiding moisture towards a central conduit. Others incorporated slightly sloped floors to facilitate runoff towards an exit. These systems were not always foolproof. During periods of heavy rainfall, water would accumulate at a rate exceeding the drainage capacity. This cultivated a distinct underground rhythm, a cycle of dampness and drying, influenced by weather conditions occurring many meters above. Illumination was another considered element. While most cells lacked direct light, hallways and guard posts frequently had torch brackets integrated directly into the stonework. These brackets were positioned at intervals, enabling guards to survey the corridor without igniting all the torches simultaneously, thus conserving resources while ensuring vigilance. The ambient radiance of a single torch could cast elongated shadows that stretched gracefully along curved stone walls. Guards became attuned to these shadows, recognizing deviations from the norm. However, perhaps the most telling characteristic of dungeon design was the intentional use of thresholds. Every doorway, archway, and staircase signified a transition. Medieval society attached considerable symbolic significance to the crossing of thresholds. To pass through one meant entering a new state of being. For inmates, the descent into the dungeon was not merely physical, but also psychological. And for those granted release, stepping back through the final portal into daylight felt akin to emerging from another realm. The architecture was designed not to inflict harm as punishment, but rather to exert control through environmental manipulation, managing space, movement, sound, and sensory experience in ways that shaped human conduct. Upon close examination of these environments, a surprising realization emerges. Medieval builders possessed a far deeper understanding of environmental psychology than is often presumed. They crafted spaces that influenced the mind as much as they physically confined the body, a profound insight in itself. Existence within a medieval dungeon was not entirely divorced from the world above. Even in the dimmest chambers, an economy, quiet, subtle, and frequently unobserved, was perpetually active. This was not an economy solely quantifiable in monetary terms, but rather one defined by access, influence, relationships, and minor privileges that held immense significance when one was confined. To grasp this veiled system, it's crucial to recall that medieval justice seldom presented a straightforward dichotomy of guilt and innocence. Numerous detainees were held temporarily, awaiting legal proceedings, resolving disputes, or settling debts. Others were merchants who had contravened local regulations, travelers lacking proper documentation, or villagers embroiled in civil disagreements. In this context, daily necessities transformed into a form of currency. The most fundamental economic transaction involved sustenance. While a standard ration might be provided by the dungeon's overseeing authority, the quality and frequency of these rations varied considerably, contingent upon local customs and available resources. Anything beyond the basic provision necessitated an exchange. Visiting family members from the outside could supplement rations, often through negotiation with the guards. A traveler arrested with personal possessions might barter small items, such as brooches, rings, or cloth, for more substantial meals. Those with nothing to trade occasionally pooled their resources, forging alliances based on mutual assistance. Yet, sustenance was merely the starting point. Light itself evolved into a commodity. A small candle, which above ground might burn unnoticed in a corner, became a treasured possession underground. Light enabled individuals to read, engage in prayer, mend clothing, or simply track the passage of time. Prisoners who received candles from relatives or sympathetic guards would distribute them strategically, frequently in exchange for companionship, information, or favors that alleviated daily challenges. Information constituted another valuable asset. News from the surface world, judicial decisions, market fluctuations, regional conflicts, or even weather advisories held substantial worth. A guard disseminating a piece of gossip could instantaneously alter the social dynamics within a shared cell. A detainee with external visitors could become a hub of knowledge, gaining influence solely through connections. Then there were the minor comforts rarely documented in official records: an extra blanket during winter, a wooden cup instead of sharing a communal bowl, or the brief opportunity to stand in a corridor with circulating air. None of these privileges were guaranteed, all derived from interpersonal relationships. The guards played a pivotal role. Contrary to popular lore, many medieval guards were not inherently cruel or indifferent. They were laborers, men with families, routines, and social obligations. Their duties involved record-keeping, escorting inmates, distributing rations, and maintaining security. Within these responsibilities, they made numerous minor discretionary decisions daily. Which inmate receives an extended moment of fresh air during a torch change? Who is served their meal slightly earlier? Whose request for water is promptly granted? Such choices impacted morale and behavior without ever being formally recorded. Over time, discernible patterns emerged. Certain guards were recognized for their fairness, others for their strict adherence to regulations, and a select few for exploiting their positions. Prisoners quickly learned to identify the personalities that dictated their daily existence. Above the ranks of the guards were the stewards or officials who supervised the broader operations. These individuals determined when repairs were necessary, how provisions were allocated, and how resources were distributed among various sections of a castle or municipal holding area. Their priorities invariably influenced conditions underground, often unintentionally. A budget reduction in the main administrative area might lead to a decline in the quality of grain supplied to the dungeon. A new directive from the city council could alter visiting hours. These subtle chain reactions shaped life in ways that were acutely felt by the prisoners. Yet, the most compelling aspect of this subterranean economy was the emergence of micro-communities. Shared adversity forged bonds that might never have materialized above ground. Individuals from disparate villages, professions, or social strata found themselves collaborating, exchanging stories, pooling resources, imparting skills, or strategizing to navigate uncertainty. In these moments, humanity manifested itself quietly and persistently. A merchant might offer guidance to a young shepherd. A scholar might recount experiences from distant lands. A traveler might assuage the anxieties of someone new to confinement. None of this is recorded in legal documentation or architectural blueprints. Nevertheless, it was profoundly real, an economy of resilience and mutual support. Viewing a dungeon solely as a place of incarceration overlooks half the reality. It was also a living environment shaped by countless decisions, exchanges, and relationships. In the obscure depths of stone corridors, where time seemed suspended, individuals created meaning, community, and structure through any means available. In doing so, they transformed even the most secluded corner of a medieval fortress into a reflection of the wider world above. One of the most disorienting aspects of medieval dungeon life was not the darkness, the confinement, or the uncertainty, but time itself. Its ability to stretch, fold, and elude perception in ways entirely alien to the world above. In a medieval town, time was marked by church bells, market openings, sunrise, sunset, and the consistent rhythm of daily activities. People awoke with daylight, labored under the sun, and rested as darkness descended. Everything followed predictable cycles, but these rhythms vanished underground. Many dungeons were entirely devoid of windows. Others featured narrow slits that admitted a faint hint of daylight, sufficient merely to confirm the continued existence of the outside world, but insufficient to establish a consistent temporal anchor. In more remote chambers, torches provided the sole source of illumination, and their lighting was dictated by the guards' needs, not the inhabitants'. A torch might burn for an extended period one day and barely flicker the next, offering no regularity. Consequently, detainees devised their own methods for tracking time. Some relied on auditory cues, the echo of footsteps at regular intervals, the distant sound of a gate opening or closing, the movement of guards during scheduled patrols. Even these sound cues were imperfect, as guard shifts changed, visitors arrived unpredictably, and acoustics distorted distances. Nevertheless, those who remained for extended periods learned to discern subtle details and patterns imperceptible to newcomers. Others tracked time through their physical sensations, the pangs of hunger between meals, the weariness following restless sleep. The sensation of cold might indicate shifts in external winds, yet even the body's internal clock could falter. Hunger became unreliable due to fluctuating rations. Sleep was fragmented. Illumination was sporadic, easily disrupted by distant noises. In such an environment, days and nights coalesced into a continuous, unbroken stretch of existence. Some prisoners established rituals to punctuate the passage of time. A quiet prayer recited at intervals, reciting a memorized story from beginning to end, whispering lessons learned in childhood, or pacing the length of the cell a specific number of times. These rituals transcended mere habit. They served as lifelines, helping to preserve a sense of identity when the external world felt distant and unattainable. Guards also influenced the perception of time. The arrival of meals, the timing of inspections, or the escorting of an individual to meet an official each served to break the monotony. A guard who arrived slightly earlier or later could fundamentally alter a prisoner's entire perception of the day. For those confined for extended periods, minor alterations felt like seismic shifts in the progression of time. A particularly striking illustration emerges from medieval accounts detailing prisoners re-emerging into sunlight after prolonged incarceration. Scribes recount individuals covering their faces, overwhelmed not only by the brilliance, but by the sudden recognition of how many days had slipped by unnoticed. Some erroneously believed only a few days had elapsed, only to discover weeks had passed. Others were certain they had endured months, when, in reality, the duration had been significantly shorter. This temporal distortion arose not solely from hardship. It stemmed from a disconnection from the natural temporal cues humans depend on, the sun's movement, the urban din, the hawker's calls, and the community's ingrained patterns. Nevertheless, within this suspended reality of blurred hours, individuals adapted. They learned to discern the subtle life patterns within the corridors. They estimated time by the gradual cooling of a stone floor. They paid diligent attention to the slightest alterations in sound and air currents. In the absence of timekeeping devices, they transformed into chronometers themselves, living instruments interpreting every environmental nuance. This adaptation transcended mere survival. It represented resilience. A quiet, profound resolve to maintain one's sense of self when the very notions of morning and night threatened to dissolve. And in those dim cells where the world's natural rhythms barely penetrated, prisoners encountered something rarely experienced by modern individuals. Time, when divested of its familiar structure, fundamentally alters a person's comprehension of their own existence. In a medieval dungeon, absolute silence was a rarity. It only seemed overwhelming because every sound resonated with greater import than it would above ground. Down there, even the most minute noise acquired a peculiar significance, becoming part of an unspoken language. It was a language prisoners employed to comprehend their surroundings, their captors, and occasionally one another. Initially, newcomers perceived sounds typically: echoing footsteps, a distant metallic clang, the protesting groan of aged hinges. However, as time progressed, these sounds segregated into distinct patterns, textures, and meanings. Footsteps conveyed narratives. A slow, shuffling gait indicated a weary guard concluding his shift. A brisk, confident pace signaled a higher-ranking individual. The successive appearance of two sets of feet suggested an escort, either an arrival or a departure. And due to the peculiar acoustic properties of underground spaces, echoes often misrepresented distances. A footfall might seem proximate when it was distant. It could sound as if behind when originating from the front. Prisoners became adept at navigating these distortions, constructing mental maps of unseen passageways. Keys served as another mode of communication. The faint jingling of metal from down a hallway signaled movement long before any figures became visible. The sound of keys brushing against fabric indicated an impending cell door opening. The heavier clatter of a full set of keys signified a guard responsible for multiple sections. Some prisoners could even differentiate the specific key rings belonging to different guards based on their size, weight, and the distinctive way they intermingled. Over time, this auditory knowledge evolved into a crucial survival asset. Doors conveyed even more explicit information. A creaking wooden door denoted age and deterioration. A reinforced door opening with a low thud suggested deeper confinement. A screeching iron gate typically marked the entrance to a primary corridor, one many prisoners never encountered. Even the sound of a latch sliding shut held emotional undertones. A hurried, careless latch signaled a guard eager to return to warmth. A slow, deliberate latch implied caution or suspicion. A secondary lock check indicated a recent disturbance involving an inmate. Water also played a role, dripping from stone ceilings, trickling through fissures after rainfall, or pooling silently in unseen alcoves. Some inmates utilized the rhythm of water to approximate time, counting intervals between drips or noting changes in the sound as the external weather shifted. Others employed it for maintaining composure, allowing the steady drip to act as an anchoring presence in a world where tranquility was scarce. Yet the most profound sounds originated from people, often conveying messages without words. A cough from an adjacent cell indicated another person's continued presence. The rustling of straw signaled restlessness or discomfort. A quiet sigh from nearby reminded prisoners they were not isolated in that hushed environment. Periodically, when guards were distant and the nights felt interminable, individuals communicated through gentle taps on the walls. Not for extended conversations, but sufficient to convey, "I am here. You are not alone. I am still persevering." Such exchanges were not always permissible, and many dungeons actively discouraged any form of communication. However, even then, people devised methods. A sharp tap served as a warning, a double tap as reassurance, a prolonged knuckle drag for discretion in a place where voices could inadvertently reach unintended ears. These subtle, coded sounds became the closest approximation of companionship for many. Nonetheless, silence held equal significance, as it was not an absence, but an information source. Uninterrupted silence indicated the absence of guards. Interrupted silence signaled activity. A prolonged period of quiet following an incident suggested a resolution occurring elsewhere. In this milieu, sound transformed into a map, a clock, an alarm system, and occasionally, a companion. But most importantly, it served as a reminder of life beyond the stone confines. A reminder that even in captivity, the world continued to move, breathe, and progress. The capacity to decipher this sonic language was not formally taught. It was acquired through necessity, through long nights, through meticulous observation, and through the peculiar enhancement of perception that occurred when every moment carried significant weight. Down in those dungeons, hearing transcended a mere sense. It was a mechanism for survival. Within the confines of a medieval dungeon, the concept of day did not vanish. It simply ceased to function according to natural principles. Devoid of sunlight, absence of shadows, and any discernible visual alteration in the external world, prisoners experienced time in a peculiar, malleable fashion. Some reported hours stretching into infinity. Others claimed entire days dissolved in what felt like mere minutes. Most simply ceased attempting to quantify it. Yet even in absolute darkness, humans sought patterns. Gradually, they discovered that dungeons possessed their own distinct rhythm, dictated not by solar cycles, but by the human activities occurring above and around them. The initial indicator was sound. Far above the dungeon, a city stirred at dawn. Foot traffic on the streets, the rumble of carts on cobblestones, the cries of market vendors, the hammering of blacksmiths, the ringing of church bells. These sounds were faint, attenuated by layers of stone and earth. But they were present, and prisoners learned to attune themselves to them. The distant pealing of church bells, soft and almost spectral, often served as their closest approximation of a clock. The first bell signaled morning. Subsequent tolls indicated midday. Deeper, final chimes marked the evening. Though minimal, these sounds provided the skeletal framework of a day. Then came the guards. Their rotational schedule, while not consistently precise, still generated discernible patterns for the prisoners. A shift in footsteps, an unfamiliar voice, a metallic jingle with a characteristic cadence. The new guard's habit of clearing his throat or absent-mindedly humming. The arrival of sustenance, however basic, offered another anchor. A bowl placed discreetly outside the cell, the scraping of a ladle against a pot's bottom, the sliding of a tray across stone, the aroma of warm broth, the earthy scent of baked grain, even the subtle fragrance of herbs on rare occasions when the cook was feeling generous. To a prisoner, these indications signified more than mere nourishment. They signified the ongoing passage of time. Nights, however, presented a different experience. Dungeon nights did not grow darker, as darkness was perpetual. Instead, they became quieter. The city above fell silent. Wind replaced footsteps. Rats became bolder. Water dripped with slower, more pronounced rhythms. The guards spoke less frequently. Sometimes they dozed off. Sometimes they patrolled with reduced urgency, their footsteps more measured. And in this stillness, prisoners found themselves confronting their own thoughts, thoughts that seemed more resonant than any external sound. Many described the nights as the most arduous period, not due to fear or solitude, but because silence compelled them to delve into memories and regrets they had strived to avoid throughout the day. Some recalled loved ones. Some reflected on past errors. Some relived the moment of their incarceration, replaying it repeatedly as if seeking an alternative outcome. And some, those who had endured the longest periods underground, adapted so completely to this peculiar rhythm that they could detect subtle distinctions overlooked by others. A slightly warmer air current suggesting daytime warmth penetrating through fissures. A faint alteration in the echo of footsteps indicating rising humidity, likely signifying evening. A change in the air's scent, less earthy and more crisp, suggesting the strengthening night winds outdoors. In a world devoid of sun or moon, without visible hours or seasons, human beings still found ways to perceive the passage of time. It was not precise, it was not dependable, but it was human. because even in confinement, even buried beneath the earth, people refused to let time simply vanish. They shaped it themselves through sound, through memory, through routine, and through the quiet resilience that sustained them. In this manner, the rhythm of dungeon life, slow, heavy, and muted, became an integral part of the survival narrative itself. The dungeon stripped away freedom. It deprived them of light, but it never entirely confiscated time. People consistently discovered avenues to reclaim it. One of the most peculiar realities of life within a medieval dungeon was the ceaseless transformation of the external world. Winter yielded to spring, summer to fall. Yet, none of this was observable. No trees bloomed, no foliage changed color, no frost formed on rooftops, no sunlight warmed the stones. Despite this visual disconnect, prisoners still apprehended the seasons, not through sight, but through more subtle signals that filtered down into the subterranean environment. Winter was the easiest to recognize. The air grew sharper, colder, and somehow thinner. Moisture lingered on stone walls longer, and condensation formed on chains and iron bars. Footsteps overhead sounded slower, heavier, as people navigated snow-laden streets. During particularly frigid winters, the dungeon itself seemed to pause in stillness. Water dripped at a slower pace, rats moved quietly, and the entire subterranean space adopted a deeper silence, as if the external world were holding its breath. Spring was more difficult to detect. There were no blossoms, no shifting skies, only subtle alterations. The air became slightly less dense. Earthy aromas intensified as rainwater seeped down from above. Distant sounds carried differently. Street noises commenced earlier and persisted longer into the evenings, and occasionally after substantial spring rainfall, the fragrance of wet grass wafted faintly through the stone crevices. Summer strangely felt the most oppressive. Heat descended and concentrated in the lower areas, generating a warmth that offered no comfort but pressed heavily on the skin. The air felt stagnant, thick, almost motionless. The only respite arrived at night, when cool breezes from above finally permeated the darkness. However, summer also produced the most boisterous days. Markets above teemed with activity. Travelers arrived and departed. Horses clattered along cobblestone roads. Children played in courtyards. Blacksmiths toiled longer, their work resonating deep within the dungeon. For the inmates, these sounds served as a reminder of a world continuing its existence without them. Autumn introduced its own particular brand of melancholy. Prisoners progressively felt the chill return. The air carried the scent of dry leaves, though faintly and with difficulty to discern. Rainfall increased, striking wooden trapdoors with unmistakable rhythms, and people above spoke in hushed tones. Harvest voices, preparing for the colder months. Some prisoners claimed autumn was the most agonizing season, not physically, but emotionally. It evoked thoughts of conclusions, of cycles completing, of time eluding them, of the external world steadily advancing toward winter once more. And each season brought different guards. Some guards despaired of winter nights and hurried their rounds. Some grew more ill-tempered in the summer heat. Some were more amenable in spring, their spirits buoyed by the transforming world. Some became severe in autumn, perhaps sensing the year's burden weighing on their own shoulders. Through these alterations in guard demeanor, air temperature, moisture, and sounds, prisoners constructed an internal calendar that was remarkably precise. Certain long-term inmates could ascertain the month within a narrow range. A select few could sense the onset of winter long before the initial frost above. Others knew precisely when the summer heat peaked and began to wane. It was a subtle aptitude fostered not by liberty, but by necessity. Because when darkness is all you possess, you begin to notice every detail the world affords you, even those most individuals overlook. Thus, seasons continued to elapse, unseen, yet palpably felt. Each one etched itself into the recollections of those subterranean. Each one impressed upon them that life persisted externally, that nature continued its cycles, even if their own lives seemed frozen in stasis. And for many prisoners, the changing seasons became an additional anchor, a quiet assurance that the world above remained alive, a reminder that time flowed onward, even when they could not. A small, tenuous hope that one day they might behold the sky again and experience the seasons directly, not through reverberations, but with their own sight. And perhaps what endures most from these unobserved seasons is the quiet reminder that time never truly halts. It maintains its consistent cadence even in the deepest stillness. And as we gradually ascend from these tranquil depths, perhaps it is beneficial to remember that every stone, every whisper of air, every faint echo in those forgotten corridors was once a component of someone's world. A world more confined than ours, darker than ours, and yet shaped by the same emotions we recognize today. Fear, hope, regret, resilience. In the silence of those underground chambers, time appeared to stretch in ways almost indescribable. Days merged into nights, seasons passed unacknowledged, and the world above continued its progression without those who waited in the shadows. And yet, even in places designed to contain despair, there existed moments of contemplation, remembrance, and quiet fortitude that belong solely to the human spirit. Tonight, as you repose somewhere warm with soft illumination or gentle darkness surrounding you, you are experiencing a form of solace they could scarcely conceive. A roof that shields you, walls that safeguard you, air that circulates freely, and a world that will still await you in the morning. Therefore, allow the quietude of this moment to be your own form of sanctuary. Let your breathing settle into an easy cadence. Permit the day's weight to slide from your shoulders, and let the distant past gently recede into the background, like the final ember of a candle diminishing at the far end of a passageway. Because whatever burdens you carried into tonight, you need not bear them at this very moment. Not now, not here. Sleep soundly, knowing you are secure, you are warm, and you are enveloped by light that countless individuals before you never possessed. Sleep knowing that the world you awaken to will be brighter than the one we explored tonight.